Hey everybody, it's James Lindsay, and you are listening to the new Discourses podcast. And I've got something I've wanted to do for a very long time to do today. I'm going to read to you a chapter from Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, which translates, of course, as My Struggle from the German. I've wanted to do this for a couple of years. I think I regret that I haven't done this, given how things have been shaping up. Maybe you've heard some of the other recent podcasts, either about the woke right or Never Again Is Now, path to de-radicalization. Obviously, I'm focusing a little bit on Nazi material now, not so much woke communism, but woke nationalism. If you don't like the term woke right, you can go with woke nationalism. The Nazis were certainly woke nationalists. They had a very woke take on what the nation represents and how they were going to organize the nation as such. So whether you like nationalism or not, as a kind of political view or as a sentiment or even as a political project, the Nazis represent woke nationalism, which is one of the worst expressions of nationalism of all time. I've wanted to record this because this second chapter, which is for those of you that followed my work for a long time, this is not the chapter we rewrote for the Grievance Studies Affair as intersectional feminism. That was chapter 12. Chapter 2 is titled Years of Learning and Suffering in Vienna. And this is the chapter where, in my opinion, Hitler explains the motivations that led him to the conclusions that went on to form what became the Nazi Party, or as we might call it, frankly, the Nazi experiment. And I think that that's a nice way to think about it, that it was an experiment. And the reason I wanted to read it, and I have wanted to read it for years, and I've spoken about this here and there. I'm always a little bit shy. The reason I've wanted to read it is because you can see the mistake that's being made. You can see the conclusions. You can see the frustrations. And the reason I'm finally caving, or the reason I haven't read this, let's say that first, the reason I haven't read this yet is frankly because I think YouTube is going to kick me off for putting up a chapter of Hitler on their platform. Fair use being what it is and all the other things aside. Well, X changes the game because if they do, not only will it be on all the other sites, but I'm going to stick it on X in full if they kick me off of YouTube or whatever for this one. But the reason I wanted to communicate it is because I see this error taking place. So the reason that I regret having not done this sooner is I see people making the same mistake that Hitler made and that the Nazis made. Now, the conditions are different. I don't want to sound too much like a Marxist here, but the historical conditions of Germany were both similar to what we're facing now and different to what we're facing now. And I want to comment on that a little bit before I just jump into reading. It's a fairly long, rambling chapter, and I don't want this to take all night, so I'm just going to kind of summarize this quickly. Basically, the conditions of Germany, this is being written in the 1920s, were the utter humiliation of the German state and the German people following World War I, which ended in 1918. So this isn't long after World War I that Hitler's writing this. This humiliation, I think, is absolutely crucial to understand. The Germans were a truly humiliated people who were looking again for a German pride that they could have in who they were as a people. It's also a little wrong to think of Germany as a nation in thinking that it was a nation at all. It was this kind of conglomeration of republics and political entities that didn't really think of itself that way, but it thought of itself more as an empire. So you can kind of start to see some parallels here. Americans are not generally humiliated. We maybe do think of ourselves sort of as an empire. We are, however, within certain subgroups of the population, particularly young men, feeling beaten down by feminism and by the leftism of the last several years, the woke Marxism. And there is a kind of core of humiliation within a subpopulation. It's not a matter of national pride, but you can actually get this sense of how Make America Great Again would resonate in the same way that had Hitler used those words, Make Germany Great Again, would have resonated. And it's a very popular piece of propaganda right now, pro-Nazi propaganda, to put out Hitler's speeches, to let people hear Hitler's own words, his own speeches, and to say, make up your own mind. And what you hear is a man, a bit deranged, maybe on methamphetamines, ranting and raving, not about his hatred for some external enemy or even an internal enemy, but rather raving about the possibilities of a greater German future. That's what they always deserved, absent this humiliation of the past, absent this broken down society. Now, there's also the Weimar Republic. Now, I think that this is a very important point. This Mein Kampf was written very early, so I don't think that this had gotten to the point of full decadence that it reached by the time the Nazis took power in 1933. They took power at the end of January 1933, if you don't know your history on this, January 30th, 1933. And the Weimar Republic was very decadent. It's famous that, for example, the Nazis' first things that they were going after were homosexual research, sexualities or sexual liberation stuff, and transgender experiment stuff. Books about this were the first books they burned. And so this is why I think it's important to think of it as the Nazi experiment. Because what I think the Nazi experiment is a failed experiment. Here you have a society that's very decadent. Nightclubs, jazz, drinking, libertine activity, we'll call it, experiments into the sexual perversion realms, etc., etc. Paired with this weird, generally anti-Semitic, generally pro-nationalist conservatism that's got this other vibe. It's a very strange mix and a very liberal government that's not really handling this mixture very well in the humiliation of everything. And they decide to run this experiment. Okay, as with the propaganda today at least goes, you have all these trans things going on. You have all this sexual degeneracy and perversion going on. Let's fix it. And the Nazi experiment can be understood as an attempt to fix it. And what happened? A catastrophe happened. Did they stop what they were trying to stop? Well, maybe, probably. It's not that hard to imagine, kind of a semi-satirical, or was it really happening, SS guards or whatever at at Auschwitz wearing women's underwear under their Hugo Boss uniforms or something, right? A lot of repressed drag queen stuff or cross-dressing stuff isn't hard to imagine within the Nazi context. Repressed homosexuality, not hard to imagine in the Nazi context. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I'm not making a historical claim or historical point there. I'm just saying it's not hard to imagine for a variety of reasons, like that fascism's really gay. But what I am saying is that the Nazis ran an experiment on a decadent society running off the rails, riddled with humiliation, riddled with a desire to distinguish itself from the French in particular, riddled with a vision of an empire that had been stolen from them in the First World War. And they decided to run an experiment to make Germany great again. And I'm using that phrasing intentionally, of course, because I'm very worried about the MAGA movement getting pulled in that direction. Not that I think it is in that direction. I'm very afraid of it getting pulled into that direction by foreign and domestic actors with bad intentions and political warfare and propaganda techniques at their disposal, particularly young Americans who are beaten down and humiliated by the ravages of especially feminism, but woke overall. And they ran this experiment. And granted, there are specific historical contingencies like Adolf Hitler himself, like the rampant anti-Semitism that had run as a current throughout Germany, etc., etc. I'm reading this book about the Nazis that I'll talk about probably in future podcasts. It's called They Thought They Were Free. And what it expresses, the author's name is Mayer, what it expresses is that what the Nazi thing, the way that it took off, what it represented, was kind of hyper-Germanness. It was like being more German than German, right? But these were already currents. It wasn't like Hitler came in and imposed some radical new ideology on the Germans. He just took the German ideology as it was and extended it further. And when this experiment was run, what happened was a nasty war in Europe through the bid for empire of the Germans, a nasty war in Europe that's bled into a world war that killed tens of millions of people, a Holocaust of Jews and others totaling some 9 million people, if I remember that statistic right, 6 million of whom were Jews who were murdered specifically for being Jewish. Racial minorities, the mentally handicapped and mentally ill were also rounded up, but none like the Jews, and none so arbitrarily and capriciously. And so what you have is this experiment run under a set of conditions, and what you see is that the Nazi experiment was a resounding failure. The whole thing should be taken as the world, or the histories, one of the histories, not necessarily I think maybe the second or third greatest cautionary tale in history, the Great Leap Forward in China, which I've spoken about in the past, I think is a good rival in that it killed some 50 to 60 million people itself, maybe more, by other means primarily. But this is one of the greatest cautionary tales of history. So now that we have this propaganda, like listen to his speeches, Hitler's speeches, he's ranting about how great Germany can be, and we're going to have a homeland, and we're going to have living room, and we're going to have this, and we're going to have that, and the German pride is going to be restored. Listen to what he really said. That's the propaganda. You've had it hidden from you. You don't know what he really said. Listen to his speeches, and they're all positive. They're all inspiring. They're a man who loves his country, and the way that he loved his country and the ideology that he put onto his country and the things he did with that ideology are one of the greatest evils of human history. And thus we end up with one of the greatest cautionary tales of human history. Under certain circumstances, a society can come off the rails, and there might be a desperate bid to put it back on the rails. And in that bid, there might be a strong man and a demagogue who arises, who promises to put it back on the rails if you go with him, if you consider him a Führer. And in the process, catastrophe. Fantastic cautionary tale. So don't fall for the propaganda. Listen to his speeches. Yeah, of course he's being inspiring in his speeches. Don't be a fool. But what was he doing in his orders for Cyclone B? That he was sending verbally to chemical plants because nothing was going to be in writing, because they knew they were doing evil and they wanted no record of it. Of course his speeches are inspiring. What was he doing with his conquest of Poland and France and then the rest of Europe and then into Russia? Of course his speeches are inspiring. But the other side of the propaganda is, look at the mess he was cleaning up. They were going trans. They were full going queer. And the Nazis just wanted to put a stop to that. Well, maybe your general, everyday, rank-and-file German who became a Nazi was concerned about those particular things, and that's what brought this little man into that position. But Hitler did other things with those little men by the millions. 1 million or so little men with a few 100,000 officers who were willing to do whatever the Nazi Party said could drag a country of some 80 million into unbelievable disgrace, an unbelievable catastrophe. It's a perfect cautionary tale. Now that said, maybe YouTube won't kick me off. Let's go ahead and read about, in a sense, the root of the Nazi experiment. We're going to read Adolf Hitler in My Struggle, Mein Kampf, that he wrote in the 1920s, explaining what was motivating him to be where he was and to think what he thought, and then ultimately to conduct the Nazi experiment. And this is his early recollections. Years of learning and suffering in Vienna. You can tell he's got the core motivation of all evil, which is self-pity, learning and suffering. And what this chapter is where he chronicles his frustrations at dealing with Marxists and other ills of society, and concludes that, in fact, there is a reason for that, and that reason is Jewish. And that Jewish reason has a lot to do with the difference between the Jew and the German. And I think it's important for us to hear this error being made. And it's important for us to remember what happens when we make this error, because history may not repeat, but it will rhyme. And I'm seeing this error, these same calculations, these same frustrations, and these same conclusions being drawn today by Americans, by Canadians, by Brits. When my mother died, fate had already made its decision. During the last months of her life, I went to Vienna to take the entrance examination for the academy. Armed with a thick bundle of drawings, remember he was a painter, I was convinced I would find the examination mere child's play. In the secondary school, I was by far the best draftsman in my class. Since that time, my ability had only improved. My own satisfaction in my ability led me to hope for the best. So we have Hitler very proud of himself in the wake of the death of his mother, going to make it into school, believing that he is super good at what he does. There was only one single fly in the ointment. My talent for painting was frequently exceeded by my ability as a draftsman, particularly in architecture. My interest in architecture kept growing. My interest accelerated when I visited Vienna for a couple of weeks before I turned 16. I went to the art gallery of the Court Museum, and I found I had eyes almost solely for the museum itself. From early morning until late at night, I trotted from one site to another, but only the buildings held my attention. I could stand for hours looking at the Opera House and for hours admire the Parliament buildings. The Ringstrasse, circular street in the Old Town section of Vienna, the Ringstrasse section seemed like an enchantment from the stories out of 1001 Nights. I was now in the beautiful city for the second time. I waited for the results of my entrance exam as I was filled with excitement, impatience, and proud confidence. I was so certain of success that when I received a rejection, it struck me like a bolt from the blue. And yet, that was it. Period. When I called on the head of the academy and asked the reasons why I had not been admitted to the school of painting, he assured me that my drawings showed I had no aptitude for painting and that my true ability was in the field of architecture. The school of painting was out of the question, but the school of architecture was for me, even though at first they found it difficult to believe that I had never attended an architectural school or had any instruction in architecture. So his manifesto is a bit self-centered and boring if you've never heard some of this stuff. As I left Hansen's magnificent building on the square, I was at odds with myself for the first time in my young life. What I had just been told about my abilities was like a lightning flash illuminating an unexplainable confusion in me that had been growing for a long time. Within a few days, I knew I would be an architect someday. Architect of evil, haha. I could see the path before me would be enormously difficult. Everything I had been too stubborn to learn in secondary school was now taking its bitter revenge. Admission to the Vienna Academy School of Architecture required attendance of the Building School of Technology, and admission here was based on graduation and the final exams from an intermediate school. I did not have either. It seemed my dream of art was now impossible. After the death of my mother, I returned to Vienna, this time to stay for some years. I once again regained my calm and determination. My earlier spirit of defiance had also returned, and I was determined to reach my goal. I would be an architect. Obstacles exist to be overcome, and I would overcome those obstacles with the image of my father before my eyes. He fought his way from farm boy and shoemaker to state official, and my soil was richer than his, so my battle should be that much easier. What had then seemed to me to be the unkindness of fate, I accept as the wisdom of providence. When the goddess of trouble embraced me and often threatened to crush me, the will to resist grew, and at last that will was victorious. That period made me strong. I thank her for snatching me from the emptiness of a comfortable life and for pulling this mama's boy out of the comfortable, cozy bed. I was reluctantly thrown into the world of misery and poverty, which introduced me to those I would later fight for. Now we get to have some commentary. Notice that we have this story, Hitler telling his own life story that he was a mama's boy. What a surprise. And that he had a very comfortable life that his parents worked hard to give him. And then he fails at his ambition to become a first painter, then architect, for whatever set of reasons, and he says, reluctantly thrown. There's some Heidegger for you right there. Although this is before Heidegger, I think. I was reluctantly thrown, he says, into the world of misery and poverty. And what did he learn in the world of misery and poverty? He said it introduced me to those I would later fight for. Have a hint, guys. Hey, woke right, listen. Hitler was a socialist. So he was introduced to the world of misery and poverty, and that's who he's going to fight for. He's going to fight for the miserable and the poor. Why? Because his comfortable life got derailed and he didn't get what he thought. Now, the parallel today, of course, is these college kids that are going off and they're getting overeducated or miseducated, and they're frustrated with their experience. They're coming out of college, and if you believe the propaganda online, they are not getting the six-figure job out of college that, if they are white, they intrinsically deserve. That's a propaganda push on the internet. It doesn't matter that the median salary of engineers, which is a pretty technical field with a college degree, is somewhere in the mid-50,000s range. Nope. White people, the internet, the woke right on the internet are braying and have been braying. White people who graduate college with a 4-year degree deserve a starting salary in the six figures. And then, of course, what they do actually is struggle to get decent jobs. They struggle to find the job that they wanted or hoped for. They struggle to be able to buy a house. They are thrown reluctantly into the world of misery and poverty, thrust out of their comfortable life. And maybe some of them are learning to thank fate for snatching them from the emptiness of that comfortable life and pulling their mama's boys' asses out of their video game basements and their cozy beds to have this experience. Now, I exaggerate, but this is where Hitler's at. Hitler was a socialist. Hitler was a well-off, comfortable young person who then faced difficulty and challenge, met poverty, and decided that he was going to fight for them. What a typical story. To continue, that is the point when I saw two dangers approaching. Maybe you should have saw the danger of becoming a Nazi approaching, Adolf. Previously, he says, I did not truly understand their names or their importance to the German people's existence. Their names were Marxism and Jewry. Vienna is widely considered to be the very essence of innocence and bliss, as the festive home of happy crowds. It has turned into a constant reminder of the saddest period in my life. Even today, the city stirs only gloomy thoughts in me. 5 years of misery and wretchedness are encapsulated in the name of this Phoenician city. For 5 years, I had to earn my bread, and as a small painter, my bread was meager at best. It was never enough to satisfy my hunger. In those days, hunger was my faithful sidekick who never left me. When I bought a book, he shared it with me. A trip to the opera would give me his company for days. It was a never-ending battle with my unsympathetic friend. In those lean days, I learned faster than I had ever learned before. Besides my architecture and a rare ticket to the opera, books were my only remaining pleasure. I read voraciously. I used any free time I found to study. After a few years, I was able to lay the foundations of a knowledge which I still live on today. So he's autodidactic, by the way, self-taught. At that time, I formed an image and a concept of the world which had become the rock-solid foundation of my present political activity. Since that time, isn't that ominous when you realize it's Hitler that wrote that, right? Since that time, I needed only to learn a little beyond what I had already assembled, because I found there was nothing in my image that required changing. There's nothing in his image that required changing, my goodness. On the contrary, today I firmly believe that all creative ideas usually appear in youth, if they exist at all. I must distinguish this from the wisdom of age, which is a thoroughness and a caution forced by the experiences of a long life. This is different from the genius of youth, who pours out unending thoughts and ideas, while their great number prevents them from being developed. This youthful genius furnishes the foundation from which an older and wiser man can build stones into a structure. At least that is the case of the so-called wisdom of age. At least that is the case if the so-called wisdom of age does not choke the genius of youth. My early home life differed little from the home life of others. I could watch for the next day without a care and without any problems to worry about. My youth was spent in lower middle class circles. That is to say, I was in a world that was not in contact with those who worked at pure physical labor. Strange as it may seem at first glance, economic differences between this level and that of ditch diggers is often deeper than one thinks. This antagonism comes from a social group which has just recently lifted itself from the ranks of physical labor and is afraid it could fall back, or at least be counted as one of them. This is the little bourgeoisie that Marx talked about. By the way, since I've brought up that he's a socialist, I have literally a couple of feet from my right hand where I'm sitting recording this, a medallion that I was sent as a gift. It is a authentic 1934, so after the Nazis took over, 1934 Labor Day celebration medallion from Germany, a Nazi medallion. And it says Tag der Arbeit across the top, so Labor Day, and it has this kind of creepy looking Frankenstein face on it. And then it has the Reichsadler, which is the German eagle with its spread wings, standing upon the swastika. And it says 1934 across the bottom, and in each wing you have an object. The one wing holds a hammer, and the other wing holds a sickle. And that, my friends, is where Nazism is based. So here, when he's talking about this, what he's learning, I grew up lower middle class, then I became poor later, and this gave him a reflection on the laboring, the proletariat laboring working class. And this was, in his opinion, formative. So just a little color on what he said so far. A man from the higher social levels, Hitler tells us, can mix with worker classes in a way that would be thinkable to the relative newcomer of this lower middle class. And I don't know if that should say unthinkable. This PDF may not be perfect. A newcomer to a social class is anyone who fights his way by his own energy from one's position in life to a higher one. But eventually, this bitter battle kills off human sympathy for the class he escaped. One's own painful struggle for existence destroys his feeling for the misery of those left behind. In this respect, fate took pity on me. By forcing me back into the world of poverty and insecurity, which my father had once abandoned, the blinders of a limited lower middle class education were removed from my eyes. He woke up. Only then did I learn how to distinguish between a hollow or brutal man's exterior and his inner nature. In the early years of this century, Vienna was among the most socially unhealthy of cities. It was a combination of glittering wealth and revolting poverty. Good thing he woke up to see this. In the center of the inner districts, one felt the heartbeat of an empire of 52 million people, along with the dangerous magic of this state of mixed nationalities. State here is capitalized, so it means a government. The blinding magnificence of this cultural and government center was like a magnet to the wealth and intelligence of the state. On top of that came the extreme centralization of the Habsburg monarchy. It offered the only possibility of holding this stew of people together. The result was an extraordinary concentration of high government offices in the capital and around the imperial residence. Vienna was Vienna was not only the political and intellectual center, but also the economic capital of the old Danube monarchy. In contrast with the army of high officers, officials, artists, and scholars were a larger army of workers who were against the wealth of the aristocracy and their practice of bleeding poverty for all they could. The palaces of the Ringstrasse became a waiting room for the thousands of the unemployed, and below the Arc of Triumph of old Austria, the homeless lived in the twilight and slime of the sewers. There was not one German city where the social situation could have been better studied than in Vienna. Do not be misled. This, quote, studying cannot be done from above. Someone who has not been in the clutches of the viper cannot truly know its venom. Studying from above results in superficial chatter or the formation of false opinions based on emotion. Does that sound like studying from above develops a false consciousness about the nature of poverty and what causes it? Sure does. Sounds very Marxist. Both are harmful. One because it can never reach the heart of the problem, the other because it passes by the problem entirely. I do not know which is more devastating, to ignore those who lack the basic necessities such as we see in those who are favored by fortune or lived well as a result of their own effort, or is it those who stand tall in their fashionable skirts or trousers and feel for the people because it is the latest fad? In any case, these people commit a sin greater than their limited intelligence will ever allow them to understand. Again, this is Marx's critique of the bourgeois and petty bourgeois looking down on the working class. And Hitler's just asking which one of those is worse. And then he says they have a false consciousness. These people commit a sin greater than their limited intelligence will ever allow them to understand. Why? Because you have to be in the grip of the viper to understand its venom. That's what he said. Then they are astonished when their fashionable, quote, social conscience, which they proudly display, never produces any results. When their fruitless good intentions are resented, they blame the ingratitude of the people. People with minds like this fail to understand that there is no place for merely social activities. When the masses want results, social displays are not enough, and there can be no expectation of gratitude for such a show. It is not a matter of distributing favors, but of redistribution and justice. Hitler sounds exactly like a Marxist. He's studying this in books and on the streets of Vienna, figuring out these ideas. He says, I did not learn about the social problem by observing from the outside. It drew me into its magic circle of suffering. How many times do I have to tell you guys that that's the core belief, is that in Marxism, is that the people who are suffering are awakened to a truer view of reality by virtue of their suffering. Here, Hitler literally calls it a magic circle. I did not learn about the social problem by observing it from the outside. It drew me into its magic circle of suffering, and instead of teaching me, it sought to test its strength on me. And it receives no credit if I survived its tests safe and sound. I could never completely relate my sensations from that time. I can only describe the essential and most staggering impressions here, along with the lessons I learned. So this is super Marxist thinking. I rarely had difficulty finding work. I was not a skilled worker, but I had to earn my bread as best I could. So I did so as a helper or a day laborer. I had the attitude of the laborers of Europe who shake the dust from their feet with the determination to build a new life and a new home in the new world, meaning the United States. They are free from preconceived notions of occupation and social background, of status and tradition, and they grasp any means of support that is offered to them. They go to any job and gradually arrive at the realization that honest labor is no disgrace, no matter what kind of labor it may be. I, too, was determined to leap with both feet into a world that was new to me and to find my way through it. I soon learned that someone always needs some kind of work, but I learned just as quickly how easy it is to lose that support again. The insecurity of one's daily bread soon became one of the darkest aspects of my new life. The skilled worker is turned out on the street less often than the unskilled, but even he can be pushed out the door. Instead of losing his job because he is not needed, he is locked out or he strikes. Does this not sound very Marxist? It's very similar to Marxism. This dependence, he says, reveals a weakness in the whole economic system. The peasant boy who is drawn to the big city by the promise of easier work and shorter hours is accustomed to a certain amount of security. He has never left one job without having another, or at least the prospect of another lined up. As more boys are drawn into the city, the shortage of farm labor takes its toll and the chance of being unemployed increases. Now it would be a mistake to think that the young fellow who goes to the big city is made of sterner stuff than the one who stays home and makes an honest living from the soil. No, quite the contrary. Experience shows that emigrant groups are more likely to be made up of the healthiest and most energetic individuals, and these emigrants include not only the man who goes to America, but also the young farmhand who leaves his native village to move to the distant big city. He is just as prepared for an uncertain fate as the farm boy going to another country. Usually, he comes to town with a little change in his pocket to last him at least a day, if he does not immediately find work. However, his situation will quickly worsen if he finds a job, then loses that job at the wrong time. Finding a new job as a worker can be almost impossible in winter months. For the first few weeks, he receives unemployment benefits from his union and does his best to survive. But when his last penny is gone and the union benefits expire, he then finds himself in a difficult position. So remember, Hitler is now condemning the entire economic system. He walks the street as his stomach growls, perhaps pawns or sells his last possessions. His clothes become fewer in number and worse in condition, which drags down his appearance. Soon he finds himself in surroundings that corrupt him not only physically but spiritually. If he then becomes homeless in winter, his suffering becomes even more intense. Eventually he's able to find some sort of work under a union, but then the game begins all over again. He is hit a second time with unemployment in the form of a strike, then the third time may be even worse. Gradually, he learns to become indifferent to the constant insecurity of his finances. The cycle changes into a habit that he continues without further consideration. We now have an otherwise hard-working man whose attitude toward life grows slack and gradually matures him into a tool of those unions who will merely use him to gain their own advantage. He is so frequently switched between working and non-working through no fault of his own that he no longer notices whether the strike in which he takes part will secure him any economic rights or whether it is an attempt to destroy the state, the whole social order, and even civilization itself. He may not like the idea of going on strike, but he is completely indifferent when he is handed strike papers. I have watched this process 1,000 times with my own eyes. The longer I saw the game continue, the more I disliked this city of millions. It greedily sucks men in, then cruelly wears them to pieces. When men came to the city, they still belonged to their nation. When they stayed, they were lost to it. Notice what he said. We're pausing here. Remember earlier when I said that a great synonym for woke right would be woke nationalism. When the men came to the city, they still belonged to their nation. When they stayed, they were lost to it. So there's this idea of the nation at the heart of this thinking that's going to be the inspirational banner. And so then everything is going to be cast in kind of woke terms around, well, what is the nation? Who counts as a member of the nation? What does it mean to be a part of the nation? And Hitler had some answers to those questions, as we know. And importantly, who are the enemies of the nation? Just like in the Chinese situation, where Mao had the people and the enemies of the people, which arguably he learned from Nazi philosophers like Carl Schmitt in his Friend-Enemy Distinction, the people and the enemies of the people, right? Well, here you're going to have the nation and the enemies of the nation. And in this other book I'm reading, they thought they were free. It's talked about that way. There are the people who are part of the program, and they all have all these legal rights and so on within the Nazi regime. And then There are no legal rights for the people that are designated enemies of the nation. We all know who he designated as enemies of the nation. First it was the communists, as it turns out, and then later it was Jews and other undesirables. So Hitler continues, "Life threw me around in the great city too. I felt the full force of such a fate, body and soul. I discovered something else as well. Quickly switching between periods of work and unemployment, along with the seesawing of income and expenses, eventually destroyed many people's sense of thrift and intelligent planning. The body becomes accustomed to living high in good times and starving in bad. They no longer make any effort to plan sensibly in good times, for the bad times they know will come. Indifference surrounds its victim with a mirage which makes them see only well-fed prosperity, regardless of their true circumstances. This mirage grows to such morbid intensity that they give up all self-control the moment wages begin to flow into their pocket. That is why a man who has difficulty finding any work stupidly forgets to plan for bad times when he does find work. He instead lives greedily and indulges in the moment. His tiny weekly income is instantly spent because he does not even plan for the remainder of the week. At first, his wages last 5 days instead of 7, then only 3, then scarcely a day, to be at last squandered the first evening. These men are not living life by themselves. Sorry, I left a word out. These men are not all living life by themselves. They likely have a wife and children at home. Their family is also poisoned by this way of life, especially if the man is naturally kind to them and even loves them in his way. By the way, this is a German thing, that according to, at least to this other book that I'm reading, this is a German thing. Family life in Germany in the 1920s was harsh. We'll just phrase it that way. Before the week's pay has evaporated in 2 or 3 days, they eat and drink as long as the money holds out. They then go through the remaining days together on empty stomachs. Then the wife slinks about the neighborhood, borrowing a bit here and there, opening charge accounts with the shopkeepers, and trying thus to survive the terrible later days of the week. At noon, they all sit at a table which does not contain enough for everyone. If it contains anything at all, they sit waiting for the next payday, talking of it, making plans. While they starve, they are already lost in the mirage of the good fortune which comes on payday. The children, even in their youngest days, will come to see this wretched life of empty fantasy as normal. So here you have material conditioning or material determinism. The situation can become worse if the man lives like this and the wife objects for the sake of their children. Then there are quarrels and bad blood, and the more the husband drifts apart from his wife, the nearer he drifts to alcohol. Every Saturday he becomes drunk. Now his wife must fight for the few pennies she can snatch from him in an effort of self-preservation for herself and the children. What she can get is only what is left over from his journey between the factory and the bar. When he finally comes home on Sunday or Monday night, drunk, brutal, and penniless, there are likely to be scenes that would wring tears from a stone. I saw all this going on in hundreds of cases. At first, I was disgusted or outraged. I later came to realize the tragedy of this suffering and to understand its deeper causes. Because he's woke. They were the unhappy victims of evil circumstances. The housing conditions of those days were worse. The housing situation of the Viennese laborer was absolutely frightful. I shudder now when I think of those wretched caverns some lived in, of the houses where journeymen of a common trade lived together in mass dormitories, which were sinister pictures of refuse filled with disgusting filth and worse. It was bound to happen. The flood of slaves let loose from these squalid caves pours down upon the rest of the world, upon its thoughtless fellow men. It is bound to happen again. This other world lets things drift without thinking about the consequences. It has lost its instinct to tell it that sooner or later. Fate will move toward retribution unless mankind placates destiny before time runs out. So, if you've never read Hitler before, which I'm assuming most of you haven't, it's a lot like this. It's a lot of ranting. Benito Mussolini famously thought it was a bunch of ranting and didn't like it. This caused a problem between him and Hitler. But here you have amidst a bunch of ranting, a relatively important sentence, right? Sooner it has lost its instinct to tell it that sooner or later fate will move toward retribution unless mankind placates destiny before time runs out. This is another way of saying that there's going to be a revolution if you don't make stuff work. If this is the situation that you throw men into in larger and larger numbers, there is going to be a revolution. He says, I am indeed thankful to a providence for sending me to that school of hard knocks in the city. There I could not sabotage what I did not like. I had to quickly grow up. If I wanted to avoid falling into despair because of the people who surrounded me, I had to learn the distinctions between their outer character and inner life and the circumstances that created their lives. Only through this understanding could I bear it all without giving up to despair. It was no longer human beings who rose before me out of unhappiness and misery, out of squalor and physical degradation, but the sad products of sad laws. It's a systemic problem. At the same time, my own fight for life, which was no easier than theirs, preserved me from becoming emotionally involved with the products of this ill society and allowed me to remain objective. No, emotional sentimentality will not help understanding here. Even then I saw that only a twofold path could lead to the improvement of such conditions. I experienced a deep feeling of social responsibility to establish a better system for our development. I knew it would require brutal determination to destroy this human outgrowth, which had no chance of being preserved and corrected. Nature does not focus on preserving what exists. Nature concentrates on breeding a new generation to perpetuate the species. So here we get into his, kind of brutal Darwinism. But he's saying that we can't reform this. What we need to do is bulldoze it. We need a revolution, and we need something completely new because nature concentrates on breeding a new generation to perpetuate the species. There's the other thing. He sees everything in his whole picture, this desperation, his anger, the whole Nazi experiment is predicated off of this belief that the preservation of the species itself becomes in question, or for him, really, the preservation not of the species, but of the German, which he saw as a separate species and superior. He says it is almost impossible for man to improve those bad things that exist in society, but it is much easier to create healthier paths from the start. So burn it all down and make something new. Even during my struggle for existence, Mein Kampf, even during my struggle for existence in Vienna, I realized the task of improving social elements could never be frivolous welfare schemes. They are ridiculous and useless. Instead, we must overcome the fundamental weaknesses in the organization of our economic and cultural life. So they're going to have a whole new program with new organization of economics and a new organization for cultural life. This is the Nazi experiment in its most, its most seed-like form. The holes, he says, in the system are bound to lead to the perversion of individuals, or at least they are capable of doing so. Wavering judgment is the enemy that will halt our advance when we need to use the most brutal weapons against a criminal group that is hostile to the state. Notice the language. This uncertainty results from a feeling of personal guilt and responsibility for the tragic decline of society. Does that if you were to say that sentence, these sentences, those two sentences, at something like a Turning Point conference in front of a bunch of young, whipped up conservative men, how do you think they'd be received? Wavering judgment. Imagine you're some Turning Point celebrity. I won't name any, I guess, because that's not fair, but on the stage at the Turning Point conference. Wavering judgment is the enemy that will halt our advance when we need to use the most brutal weapons against a criminal group that is hostile to the state. Maybe they're talking about Epstein. Maybe they're talking about the deep state. This uncertainty results from a feeling of personal guilt and responsibility for the tragic decline of society. How do you think those sentences would be received today? I think enthusiastically. Uncertainty cripples any serious and firm resolve and results in opinions swaying from one side to the other, leaving any decision that is made weak and half done, even when it comes to the most essential measures of self-preservation. So all you got to do is kind of use self-preservation in the modern context as a euphemism covering up the idea of, say, white self-preservation over replacement theory. Only when there comes an age not haunted by the shadow of its own guilt will there be both the inward calm and the outward strength which can brutally and ruthlessly prune the dead limbs and uproot the weeds of our society's garden. So that's a little dictator speech there. It goes a little bit beyond what you would expect to hear or have well received. That note might fall flat or weird in such a conference, which is nice. But so much of the rest of that fits so squarely with the moment that we find ourselves in. That's why I think this was important to go through. And this is, of course, no shade toward Turning Point. I'm just using that as a example of a platform where lots of young conservative people, especially young conservative men, are listening. The Austrian state, Hitler tells us, had no real social legislation or system for administration of justice at all. Its weakness in suppressing even the worst abuses was obvious to everyone. That's not terribly far from the parallels to our own situation now. I do not know what horrified me more, the economic misery of my neighbors, their moral weakness, or the low state of their intellectual development. This is all strongly paralleling stuff that our increasingly very political people might see in themselves. How does, sorry, let me get that right. Hitler says, how often does our social class rise up in righteous indignation when it hears some wretched tramp say that he does not care whether he is German or not? Okay, let's just reread that sentence slightly differently. How often does our movement rise up in righteous indignation when it hears some wretched fool say that he does not care whether he's an American at all? It's very close, right? He says that he is equally happy anywhere so long as he has what he needs to live on. The lack of, quote, national pride should be deeply condemned and such sentiments should be loudly admonished. How many have really asked themselves why their own way of thinking is better? How many realize there are countless reminders of the grandeur of the fatherland in every field of culture and art? When these reminders are combined, those affected have a justified pride in belonging to such a fortunate people. I'm hoping you're hearing the echoes that make me concerned. This rhetoric, these speeches, so to speak, would resonate with minimal changes and a little bit of tempering, a little bit of calming down, a little bit of taking the brutality off of the edge of it, and maybe not always. Pride in the fatherland, he says, is built on knowing about its greatness in all these fields. Have the members of our social class noticed that this knowledge which is needed to instill pride for the fatherland is not available to the people? We cannot use the excuse that, quote, it is the same in other countries, because the worker in other countries has no difficulty holding on to his nationality. Even if this were so, he says, it would be no excuse for one's own shortcomings. By the way, that was a very strong sentiment. Like the whole H-1B visa debacle that took place online kind of fits into that, right? Americans are just interchangeable economic units to the people who disagreed in that particular fake debate, right? So that would line up pretty closely with, we cannot use the excuse that it is the same in other countries because the worker in other countries has no difficulty holding on to his nationality. Only Americans are asked not to hold on to their nationality and to just shut up and do their job, right? You can hear the same kinds of frustrations, the same kind of rhetoric. And again, the framing here is that the Nazi experiment followed this sentiment, this rising, bubbling sentiment. And the Nazi experiment was a catastrophic failure. As a cautionary tale, the Nazi experiment was, when in these conditions, don't go this way, right? So even if this were so, Hitler tells us, it would be no excuse for one's own shortcomings. The French people teach France's greatness in every department of culture, or as the Frenchman says, of civilization, and we foolishly dismiss it as a fanatical glorification in their upbringing. The young Frenchman is simply not trained to be objective, but instead he is given a subjective attitude of greatness anywhere the political or cultural aspect of his fatherland is concerned. So now we're looking at nationalism, right? Again, we could just transform this out. Should Americans be thinking of themselves in this way? This type of education, Hitler says, has to be widespread, and if necessary, it must be pounded into the people's memories and feelings by perpetual repetition. With us, There is both the sin of omission and a destruction of what little we were lucky enough to learn in school. The rats infecting our political system gnaw even the tiny bit we have learned out of the hearts and memories of our people. Poverty and wretchedness have also done their share to crush these memories. Now remember, this is in the humiliation of Germany following World War I, but we are in the humiliation of the attempted cultural revolution of woke Marxism. That's why these parallels exist, though for very different reasons. Here's an example, Hitler says. In a basement consisting of 2 stuffy rooms lives a laborer's family of 7. Among the 5 children is a boy of 3 years. This is the age when a child first becomes conscious of things around him. Gifted people carry memories of that period far into old age. The small, overcrowded space produces an unfortunate situation. The conditions often generate quarrels and bickering. The people are not living with one another. They are merely living in the same place, squeezed together. Every small argument leads to a snickering quarrel. In a larger dwelling, the argument would be easily smoothed out simply by separation. The children must tolerate these conditions because children can quarrel constantly and forget the argument quickly. However, a daily battle between parents slowly teaches the children a lesson. The dispute may take the form of a father's brutality to a mother, of a drunken maltreatment. Any person who does not know of this life can hardly imagine it. By the time the boy goes from 3 to 6, he's developed a working idea of the world which must horrify even an adult. Now he is morally infected and physically undernourished, and the young citizen is sent to primary school with vermin living in his poor little scalp. Now with great difficulty he must learn reading and writing, and that is about all he can manage. Studying at home is out of the question. Father and mother argue and use language that would not be socially appropriate right in front of their own children, making studying impossible. But when the parents talk to teachers and school officials, they are more inclined to talk roughly to them than to turn their young child over their knee and introduce him to reason. That's a nice little way of phrasing that, I guess. Nothing this little fellow fears at home strengthens his respect for his fellow human beings. They never utter a good word about humanity. No institution is safe from their profane attacks, from the school teacher to the head of the state. No matter whether it is religion or morals, state or society, everything is defamed and dragged in the muck. When the boy leaves school at the age of 14, it is hard to tell which is greater, his incredible stupidity where common knowledge and basic skills are concerned, or his biting disrespect and bad manners. The immoral displays, even at that age, make one's hair stand on end. I'll continue with this poor nihilistic little kid in a second as he's grown up, but notice the Marxist quality of analysis that he's giving us here. So back to our abused hypothetical child. At 14, he holds almost nothing sacred. He has never met true greatness, and he has experienced the abyss of everyday life. What position can he possibly occupy in the world which he is about to enter? The 3-year-old child has become a 15-year-old who despises all authority. Aside from filth and uncleanliness, he has yet to find anything which might stir him to any high enthusiasm. As he begins the more demanding parts of his life, he falls into the ruts he has learned from his father. He wanders about, comes home heaven knows when, beats the tattered creature who was once his mother, curses God and the world, and finally he is sentenced to a prison for juvenile delinquents. Here he gets his final polish. His fellow citizens are astonished at his lack of national enthusiasm. They see theater and movies, trashy literature, and yellow press day by day pouring out poison. Then they are surprised at the low morality and the national indifference of the people. They do not realize movie trash, cheap journalism, and the like would never produce the skills needed to recognize the greatness of the fatherland. Could that not apply to the situation that our poor young people growing up on TikTok and X are facing now with their completely backwards and demoralizing schools, even if their home life is great? Hitler says, "I finally realized something I had never even dreamed of before. The ability to nationalize a people is primarily a question of creating healthy social conditions that can be used to educate the individual. Only when upbringing and school training have taught a man the political greatness of his own fatherland will he achieve an inner pride that comes from belonging to such a great people. You can fight only for something you love. You can love only what you respect. You can respect only what you know. So he's going to want to control the schools and create an indoctrination program for his nationalist project. When my interest in social programs was aroused, he says, I began to study it thoroughly. A world that had been so strange to me before suddenly began to open up. And this is where this actually starts to get interesting. I apologize for, again, how rambling Hitler is, but it's very nice to actually hear that. It's amazing anybody read this book. I've struggled through it a few times, and it doesn't get better really at any point. Some parts are much worse. He says, in 1909 and 1910, I no longer needed to earn my daily bread as a laborer. I started working independently as a draftsman and watercolor artist. This line of work was difficult financially. There was barely enough earnings to keep body and soul together. However, it was great in that it was closer to my chosen profession. I was no longer dead tired when I came home from work in the evening, unable even to look at a book without dozing off. My new work paralleled my future profession. As master of my own time, I could now plan it better than before. I painted to earn a living and learned for pleasure. It's probably worth noting that this other book that I'm reading, again, They Thought They Were Free by Mayer, points out that one of the reasons that Hitler was so popular among the Germans, that he entranced, so to speak, is that he was like them. He was one of the little men. It was a little man who seized the means of production of the German economy. He says, I was also able to round out my understanding of the social problem by building a necessary understanding of the theoretical background. I studied pretty much every book on the subject I could get my hands on and plunged myself in my own thoughts. My acquaintances must have thought I was more than a little eccentric. You little nerdy weirdo. I passionately pursued my love of architecture, along with music. So rather than getting to the point, he has to talk more about himself. Along with music, I thought architecture was the queen of the arts. It was not work to spend time on it, but the height of happiness. I could read or draw late into the night, and it never made me tired. My faith was strengthened by the dream of a future that would become reality after all. Even though it took years, I was firmly convinced that I would make my name as an architect. The fact that I also took great interest in having anything to do with politics did not seem especially significant. On the contrary, I felt that it was the duty of all thinking people. Anyone who did not actively learn about politics lost all rights to criticize or complain. In this area, I continued to read and learned a lot. My definition of, quote, reading may be different from the average person's definition, he says. I know people who, quote, read all the time, book after book, word for word, but I would not call them well-read. They do have a mass of knowledge, but their brain does not know how to divide it up and catalog the material they have read. They cannot separate a book and identify what is valuable and what is worthless for them. They retain some in their mind forever, but they cannot see or understand other parts at all. Reading is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. In the first place, it should help to fulfill an individual's personal framework and give each person the tools and materials a man needs in his job or profession, whether it is for daily necessity, simple physical fulfillment, or higher destiny. In the second place, reading should give a man a general picture of the world. So we're kind of getting back to a point now that he's not talking about himself being an architect. In either case, what is read shouldn't simply be stored in the memory like a list of facts and figures. It's going to sound a little bit like Paulo Freire here, isn't it? The facts, like bits of mosaic tiles, should come together as a general image of the world, helping to shape this world image in the reader's head. Otherwise, there will be a confusion of information learned, and the worthless mix of facts gives the unhappy professor an undeserved high opinion of himself. He seriously believes that he is cultured and learned, while thinking he has some understanding of life and is knowledgeable simply because he has a stack of books by his bed. Actually, every piece of new information takes him further away from the real world, until often he ends up either in a psychiatric hospital or as a politician in government. It's a pretty sick burn, actually, right there. No man with this kind of mind can ever retrieve from his jumbled, quote, knowledge what is appropriate when he needs it. His intellect is not filled with his own life experiences, lived experience, but is filled with what he has read in books and whatever order the content appeared to land in his head. If fate reminded him to correctly use what he has learned in his daily life, it would also have to cite volume and page, or the poor guy could never find what he needed. But since fate does not do this, these, quote, knowledgeable men are embarrassed when it really counts. They search their minds frantically for appropriate comparisons and usually end up with the wrong idea. If this were not the case, then it would be impossible to understand the political achievements of our learned government heroes in high places unless we decided that they are mischievous and not mentally disturbed. Again, not that bad of a burn on the politicians there. A person who has mastered the art of proper and true reading can read any book, magazine, or pamphlet and immediately spot everything he believes he needs to remember, either because it fits his purpose or because it is generally worth knowing. What he has learned then takes its proper place in his imagination concerning the matter at hand. It can then either correct or complete that image to increase its correctness or clarity in his mind. If life suddenly presents some question that requires examination or a solution, the memory stored through this reading method will instantly recall the already imagined picture as a standard and will bring out individual bits of information on the subject which have been retained through decades, and that will be the basis for the intelligence used to clarify or answer the question. Only then is there a sense and purpose in reading. I'm pretty sure you're at this point wondering, what the hell is he talking about? Again, he rambles a lot. I'm suffering with you through an entire chapter of this book so you can get a sense of the guy and how he wrote and how he thought in his clearly, in his own mind, superior fashion. But we'll get to the parts where he makes mistakes. A speaker, he tells us, who does not study the materials to back up the issues he deals with will never be able to fight effectively for his opinions when challenged, even if it is absolutely true. In every discussion, his memory will fail him as he stammers to find someone else's words to repeat. He cannot connect to the reasoning he needs to enforce what he says or argue with his opponent. When the result is just a matter of personal ridicule, as with a speaker, this may not be fatal. But it becomes serious if fate places one of these incompetent know-it-alls in a high position, such as a head of state. Then it is serious indeed. Imagine if that happened to Hitler. Just imagine. Even at a very young age, he says, in more of his rambling bullshit style, I was careful to read, quote, properly, and this skill has helped me tremendously by improving my memory and understanding. In this light, my time in Vienna in particular was fruitful and valuable. The experiences of daily life stimulated me to constant study. Being in a position to support reality with theory and to test theory by reality, I was prevented from either suffocating in theories or growing superficial in how I judged reality. Isn't this dull? Isn't it Marxist, really? And Marx was like, blah, blah, blah. My experiences in daily life guided and encouraged me to make a thorough theoretical study of two vital questions aside from the social problem. Thank goodness we're finally getting to the part where he says something. Good thing we had that long, page-long diversion about how he reads. Who knows, he says, if I would have ever become absorbed in the doctrines and character of Marxism if my life had not simply rubbed my nose in it. In my youth, I knew almost nothing about social democracy, and what I did know was wrong. I thought it was a good thing that the social democrats were fighting for the right of all men to vote by secret ballot. Even then, my mind told me this had to weaken the hated Habsburg regime. I was also convinced that the Austrian state could never be maintained unless it sacrificed the German element living in Austria. Even at the cost of slowly converting the German elements to Slavs, there was no guarantee the empire would survive, since their ability to preserve Slavic society is highly doubtful. Therefore, I was excited about any development. I think we're off into the weeds again. Therefore, I was excited about any development which I thought would lead to the collapse of this unstable state that had condemned to death the Germanism of 10 million people. The more the language uproar gnawed at me, Gnawed at the parliament, not me. The more the language uproar gnawed at the parliament, the closer the hour of collapse approached for this Babylonian empire, and the closer the freedom of my German-Austrian people came near. This was the only way that a return to the old mother country could someday happen. The activities of the Social Democrats, that's your communists, did not seem unattractive to me at the time. I thought it was also a good thing that they were trying to improve the living conditions of the working man. At that time, I was still innocent and stupid enough to believe this could happen. What did repel me was their hostile attitude toward the fight for the preservation of Germanism and their pitiful wooing of the Slavic, quote, comrades who were willing to accept this courtship and make concessions. Otherwise, they maintained an arrogance and conceit which gave these insistent beggars their just reward. Here we go. He doesn't like the Marxists, by the way. If you didn't know that Hitler doesn't like Marxists, you're about to get a taste of that. At the age of 17, I had become somewhat acquainted with the word Marxism, and I thought socialism and social democracy were identical ideas. Again, the hand of fate opened my eyes to this unprecedented fraud on the people. So Hitler was going anti-woke. So far, I had encountered the Social Democratic Party only as a spectator at a few mass demonstrations without gaining any insight into the mindset of its supporters or the nature of its doctrine. Now, at one moment, I met face to face with the results of its training and who supported its, quote, world concept. In the course of a few months, I learned something that otherwise may have taken years, an understanding of a disease masquerading as social virtue and the love of one's neighbor, a disease which humanity must free the earth from, or the earth would soon be freed of humanity. My first encounter with social democrats was on a construction job. So he meets some Marxists on a construction job site, and he gets to know them, and he becomes super anti-woke, right? He realizes that if we don't get rid of communism, communism's going to get rid of us. It was not a good situation, he tells us, from the very beginning. My clothes were still in good shape, my language was cultivated, and my manner reserved. I had so much to do in dealing with my own fate that I couldn't trouble myself with the world around me. I was looking for work only to avoid starving, and so that I could educate myself no matter how long it took. I might not have paid any attention to my new surroundings if an event on the third or fourth day had not compelled me to immediately adopt a new attitude. I was asked to join the organized union. My knowledge of the trade union organization at the time was zero. I could not have proved whether or not it was in any way useful. When I was told I must join, I refused. My grounds for refusal were that I did not understand the situation and I would not be forced to do anything. Okay, that's based. Maybe this was the reason that they did not throw me out immediately. They may have hoped they could convert me or wear me down within a few days. In either case, they were very mistaken. Within a couple of weeks, I had reached the end of my rope. During that time, I gained a better understanding of my surroundings, and no power in the world could have forced me to join an organization whose members acted in the way they did. The first few days, I was further annoyed. At noon, some of the men went to nearby bars, while others stayed on the lot and ate their pitiful lunch. These were the married men whose wives brought them their soup in heavily worn bowls. As the week progressed, their numbers grew. I figured out the reason later. When they finished their soup, they would talk politics. I drank my bottle of milk and ate my piece of bread somewhere out of the way as I cautiously studied my new surroundings or considered my misfortune. Just soak that sentence in. That's one of my favorite sentences in this book, by the way, and I bring it up sometimes. Picture this guy at a construction site. So you got a bunch of the guys that have left, it's lunchtime, and they've gone off to the bar. And you got some other guys who are married, whose wives brought them crappy bowls of soup, and they're going to talk about politics. And then you have Hitler. He's the new guy, and here's what he says about himself. I drank my bottle of milk and ate my piece of bread somewhere out of the way as I cautiously studied my new surroundings, or considered my misfortune. What a weirdo. Still, I heard more than enough, and it seemed that people crept up beside me deliberately, hoping to force me to make my beliefs clear. In any case, what I heard irritated me to the extreme. They were against everything, the nation, because they thought it was an invention of the, quote, capitalistic classes. I heard that constantly. They were against the fatherland as a tool of the privileged class to exploit the workers, the authority of law as a way to oppress the working class, the schools as an institution to train slaves and slave owners, religion as a means of stupefying the people so they could be exploited, morals as a symbol of stupid sheep-like patience, etc. There was nothing they didn't drag through the mud. Okay, so we met Marxists. At first, I tried to stay quiet, but finally I could no longer hold my tongue. Again, picture the weirdo eating his bread, drinking his bottle of milk, flipping out all of a sudden. At first, I tried to stay quiet, but finally I could no longer hold my tongue. I began to express my beliefs and contradict them. Then I realized this was useless until I knew more about the points under dispute. So I began to go to the same sources where they drew their supposed wisdom. Book after book, pamphlet after pamphlet, I read them all in their turn. There were often heated arguments on the building lot. I went on struggling, growing more informed than my adversaries were every day, until one day the ultimate method was used that vanquishes reason: terrorism and violence. Some of the opposition spokesmen forced me either to leave the job at once by choice or to fly off the scaffolding on my head. As I was alone and resistance seemed hopeless, I preferred to follow the former advice, richer by one experience. He bravely ran away, away. Oh, brave Sir Adolf. I left filled with disgust, but at the same time so agitated that I find all this very relatable, honestly, with the woke. I'm not going to lie, this is very relatable. He's trying to deal with Marxists and they really piss you off, right? I left filled with disgust, but at the same time so agitated that it would have been impossible for me to turn my back on the whole affair. No, after the spark of the first indignation, my stiff neck once more got the upper hand. I was absolutely determined to find another construction job just the same. My decision was strengthened by the fact that I had eaten up what little earnings that I had saved in just a few weeks. I had no choice but to find work. And so the game began all over again, only to end the same way it had before. I struggled with all this. I had to ask, were these human beings worthy of belonging to a great people? He's dealing with Marxists. Were these human beings worthy of belonging to a great people? It was a painful question. If the answer were yes, the struggle for a national body was not worth the effort and sacrifice that the best individuals must make. But if the answer were no, our people were a poor lot as human beings. I was restless and uneasy during those days of brooding and wondering as I saw the mass of non-nationalistic people grow into a menacing crowd. So now we have that dimension of kind of paranoia, the people who believe in the nation and the people who don't. There's a woke feeling here. With new, stronger feelings, he says, I watched the endless rows of Vienna workmen marching in a mass demonstration one day. For almost 2 hours I stood breathless, observing the enormous human serpent twisting its way past me. At last, depressed and uneasy, I left the square and walked home. On the way, in a tobacco shop, I saw the Workers' Times, the official socialist newspaper of the old Austrian Social Democratic Party. It was also available at a cheap cafe where I often went to read the papers, but I had never succeeded in bringing myself to read the trash for more than 2 minutes at a time. Its whole tone affected me like intellectual poison. Now, under the depressing effect of the day's demonstration, an inner voice pushed me to buy a copy and read it thoroughly. And so I did that evening, fighting down frequent rage at this concentrated essence of lies. By reading the Social Democratic Press daily, the Marxists, by the way, I could study the inner nature of its train of thought better than from any theoretical literature. What a difference there was between the glittering phrases in the theoretical writings about freedom, beauty, and dignity, and these words in the paper created an illusion of profound wisdom with some difficulty due to the disgusting moral tone, all written with a brazen claim of prophecy. The brutal daily press of this doctrine claimed to be the salvation of a new humanity, but was full of vileness, using every kind of slander, and absolutely full of lies. The theory is intended for stupid dupes of the middle and upper levels of intelligence. The more vile and base sections were targeted at the masses. To me, dwelling on the literature, by the way, the Marxist press is like that. when we did the podcast recently when I read about propaganda from Revolution, that's actually what it says. I mean, that's what they say that it's for, that there's the normal pamphlet stuff that's for the agitation, for the masses, to agitate them to action. And then there's revolution for the propaganda to brainwash people. So that's correct. Hitler has got these guys kind of dead to rights, and they really are frustrating. But he's going to take a wrong turn, and that's the point. To me, he says, dwelling on the literature and press of this doctrine and organization meant finding my way back to my own people. What once seemed an impassable gulf now created in me a love greater than ever before. Only a fool, once he knows about this enormous work of corruption, could still condemn the victims. The more independent I became in the next few years, the more my insight grew into the inner causes of Social Democrat success. Now I understood the meaning of the brutal demand that only red newspapers could be I understood the meaning of the brutal demand that only red newspapers be subscribed to, only red meetings be attended, only red books be studied. Red is capitalized. That means communist here, by the way. With sparkling clarity, I saw right in front of me the inevitable result of this doctrine of intolerance. Okay. Are you keeping up with what's going on? Now, that last part, it's pretty clear that, he's understanding why communists only read communist stuff. But the more independent I became in the next few years, the more my insight grew into the inner causes of Social Democrat success, right? He understood the meaning behind it. And he was being driven back to his own people. So what he's doing is he's figuring out, as we've heard from the woke right recently, that Marxist analysis of the circumstances is right, but the conclusions are wrong. There's one mistake. There's one of the mistakes of Hitler. Marxist analysis of the situation is not correct, actually. It's not just that the conclusions are wrong. The conclusions actually follow in the Marxist doctrine from the assumptions upon which the entire thing is built. But he goes on. The soul of the great masses of people is receptive to nothing weak or halfway. So this is the lesson that he's drawn. This is why he thinks they have this intolerant view and you're only supposed to read this, read that. The soul of the great masses of people is receptive to nothing weak or halfway, like a woman whose spiritual perceptions are attracted more by the strength of a leader than the reason of a follower. The masses love the ruler more than the follower, and they find more inner satisfaction in a doctrine that tolerates nothing that it itself has not granted approval and freedom. The masses are seldom able to make much use of such freedom and are likely to feel neglected if given too much. So listen to these conclusions. The masses are basically stupid. The masses want to be told what to do. The masses don't like weakness. The masses like nothing weak or halfway. The masses are like a woman who needs to be led. The masses are seldom able to make use of freedom and feel neglected if they have too much of it. So they don't want too much freedom. They want to be told what to do. They are, he says, as unconscious of the shamelessness that intellectually terrorizes them as they are of the outrageous mistreatment of their human liberty. After all, they have no clue about the doctrine's internal error. They only see the ruthless strength and brutality of its expression, which they always yield to. So the masses are sheep, and if you come in with a brutal doctrine, they'll follow you. This is what he's taken from studying the Marxists. He says, if social democracy opposes a more truthful but equally brutal theory, the new theory will win, even if it requires a battle first. Hang on. If social democracy opposes a more truthful but equally brutal theory, the new theory will win, even if it requires a battle first. In less than 2 years, I developed a clear understanding of both the doctrine and the technical methods of that the Social Democrats used to propagate it. So he's learned how to do Marxism, but he doesn't like Marxism. He has nationalist conclusions, not Marxist conclusions. They're still socialist, as a matter of fact. And they're still aimed at the masses and the masses of the workers. Those are his own people, one of these little people that is so relatable to the German public. He says, I realize the infamous intellectual terrorism of this movement targets the privileged class, which is neither morally nor spiritually a match for such attacks. They tell a barrage of lies and slander against the individual adversary it considers most dangerous and keep it up until the nerves of the group being attacked give in and they sacrifice the hated figure just to have peace and quiet again. Doesn't that sound familiar? I mean, Hitler understands what the Marxists are doing, but what he's doing is saying, shit, they're onto something. He says, but the fools still do not get peace and quiet. This is everything that I've just told you guys about for 3 years about struggle sessions, by the way. The game begins again and is repeated until fear of the villain becomes hypnotic paralysis. We all just lived through this, through the Marxist woke cultural revolution that they foisted on us. So we know that that analysis is correct, but what does Hitler do with it? He says, since the Social Democrats know very well the value of power from their own experience, their storming is directed mainly at those whose character has the same quality. Conversely, they praise every weakling on the other side, cautiously then loudly, according to the intellectual qualities they see or suspect. They fear an impotent, weak-willed genius less than they fear a forceful nature with only a modest intellect. Their highest recommendation goes to weaklings in both mind and nature. They are successful in creating the impression that giving in is the only way to win peace and quiet from them, while they quietly, cautiously, but unerringly conquer one position after another, either by quiet extortion or by actual theft when the public attention is on other things. The public is distracted and either unwilling to be interrupted, or they consider the situation too small to worry about and believe it is not worth provoking the angry foe again. Once again, you should find this very relatable. Hitler's explaining how the Marxists manipulate situations and take over, which we just lived through. These are tactics planned by exact calculation to exploit every human weakness, and it is almost mathematically sure to be successful unless the other side can learn to fight poison gas with poison gas. Those who are weak in nature, it can only be said that this is a simple question of survival or non-survival. To those who are weak in nature, it can only be said that this is a simple question of survival or non-survival. To me, the significance of physical terrorism toward the individual and toward the masses was plain to see. Terrorism on the job, in the factory, in the meeting hall, at the mass demonstrations will always be successful unless equal terrorism opposes it. Do you see us making this same mistake? When the Socialist Party encounters opposition, it screams bloody murder and yells for help from the state, only to get what they want in the end. That is to say, it finds some idiot of a high official who hopes to befriend the Marxists and is willing to crush the current adversary of the Socialist Party to gain the party's favor. I'm sure that's feeling very familiar to many of you. The followers' and rebels' success can be understood only by a man who knows the soul of a people, not from books but from life. So a little man, right, with lived experience. While its supporters regard it as a triumph of right for their cause, the beaten opponent usually feels future resistance is pointless. The better I understood the methods of physical terrorism in particular, the more I was able to forgive the hundreds of thousands who had given into it. This realization is something I am most profoundly grateful for during that period of suffering. It gave me back my people, and I learned to distinguish the victims from the deceivers. Now, I hope I have actually honestly led you through a similar process. I see this very similarly, and I've said that most of the woke people and woke type officials that you deal with and squishes that you deal with out there are in fact primary victims of the woke abuse cycle, which they then turn around and use to abuse others downstream. Hitler says he's grateful. It gave me back he hated these people that were going along with the program, and then he realized that they were actually victims of Marxism, and it gave him back the ability to like these people. I think that honestly there's a valuable lesson there, but remember, what we're doing here is we're talking about how Nazism is the cautionary tale for we're dealing with this set of circumstances, and we have something to do with it, and Hitler came up with some analysis that I think touches on a lot that's correct, and then ends up taking it in a direction that is utter catastrophe. And I think it's incumbent upon us to learn from this and not make the same errors. Right? He says the result of this seduction of mankind can only be described as victimization. If in some pictures of life I have drawn the character of these lowest humans, that picture would not be complete without my assurance that in these depths I found light in the form of extraordinary self-sacrifice, faithful comradeship, contentment in adversity, and complete modesty, especially among the older workmen. Even though these virtues were gradually disappearing in the younger generation through the influence of the big city, there were still many whose good, healthy blood overpowered the vileness of life. So it was their blood that was overcoming their ideology and the circumstance. If in politics, these kind, honest people failed to join together, so his definition of nation, by the way, is in blood. It's in kinship. That's important to note, because he's using ethno-nationalism is the thing that he's happy to have regained, which is not an American value, whether you like that or not. It simply isn't. He says, if in politics these kind, honest people failed to join together and fill the ranks instead of our people's deadly enemies, it was because they couldn't and didn't understand the vileness of the new doctrine, and because nobody else bothered to give them any attention, and finally, because social conditions were stronger than any rebellion. Sooner or later, the impoverished were bound to be the victims, and they would be driven into the Social Democrats' camp. Many times, the privileged class, in a clumsy and immoral manner, formed a united front to oppose worker demands that were justifiable and based in fundamental humanity, and they did this without offering any excuse, without any reason. Therefore, even the most decent of workmen was driven from the trade union organizations into political activity. Millions of workers were inwardly hostile to the Social Democratic Party at first, but their resistance was overcome by the often pointless and insane way in which the privileged class parties opposed any social demands. The inflexible refusal of reasonable demands such as to improve working conditions, simple safety devices on machines, prevention of child labor, protection for women, at least during the months of pregnancy, this all helped to drive the masses into the nets of social democracy, which gratefully latched on to every case of similar contemptible sentiments. Our politicians or privileged class can never rectify these past sins. By resisting all attempts to cure social ills, it sowed hatred and apparently justified the claim that the Social Democratic Party alone represented the interests of the working people. Above all, the privileged class furnished the moral excuse for the existence of the unions, which have always been the greatest suppliers for the socialist political party. So again, this is fantastic. This guy is looking at Marxism in his country, seeing what it's doing and how it operates, and he's got them perfectly nailed down. We're not seeing him make the mistake here. The mistake is in his nationalism, his brutality, having to answer brutality, that the brutality of the movement is good, that you can use that technique to sway people. But his analysis here is correct. This is how they work, right? And you've just lived through it, so you know it. So we're in a parallel story. My point is what this book led to. You know what this movement led to when it went with the errors that he makes, which we are going to discuss as we get further into this. And it is our job in similar circumstances not to make the same errors. That is the point here. So, he says, during my Vienna apprentice years, I was forced to adopt some beliefs, whether I wanted to or not, regarding the union question. As I considered them an inseparable part of the Social Democratic Party, my decision was swift and wrong. I rejected them without hesitation. In this infinitely important question, fate itself instructed me, and eventually I had to overturn my rash judgment. At 20, I had learned to distinguish between the union as a means to defend the employees' general social rights and win better living conditions, and the union as a tool of the Socialist Party promoting the political class struggle. The Social Democrats, he says, realized the enormous importance of the trade union movement, and that assured them a position of power. Because the privileged class failed to understand this importance, it lost its political position. The privileged class thought they could sweep aside a logical argument by a bold denial, and through political force push the issue down and make it look like an unreasonable path. It is nonsense and a lie to say any union movement is in itself hostile to the fatherland. The opposite is nearer the truth. If union activity envisions and attains the goal of improving the position of a class that belongs to the pillars of the nation, its effect is not hostile to state or fatherland, but it is national in the truest sense of the word. So here he's saying, look, the union model is correct, but it needs to be focused on the nation. It's helping to lay the social groundwork necessary to maintain the nation. Without this groundwork, no education is thinkable. The trade union movement gains the highest credit for destroying social cancers by attacking both intellectual and physical toxins, and thus contributing to the general health of the body of the nation. To question whether or not a union is a necessity is really pointless. It is obvious that they are necessary. As long as there are employers with little social understanding or even with a faulty sense of justice and an inability to see what is appropriate, it is not merely the right but the duty of their employees to protect the public interest against the greed or unreasonable acts of individuals. The preservation of honor and faith in a nation is a national interest just as much as the preservation of the people's health. The nation's faith and public health are seriously threatened by unworthy business operators who do not feel themselves to be members of the people's community. The evil effects of their greed or ruthlessness cause serious harm for the future of the nation and the people. Not to link the Maha movement, but again, we have very similar circumstances, right? To remove the causes of these problems is a service to the nation. No one can say that every individual is free to walk away from any supposed injustice. No, such claims must be regarded as an attempt to divert attention from the facts. Correcting bad or antisocial elements is either in the nation's interest or it is not. If correction is in the interest of the nation, we must make war upon the problems with weapons which offer some promise of success. The individual worker is never in a position to defend himself against the strength of a large enterprise. Therefore, this can never be a question of victory for the cause of right versus wrong, because the justice of the cause can be determined by the one in the position of power. If the decision were based on just how the claim was, people's sense of justice alone would end the dispute honorably and amicably, and then things would never even reach the point of a dispute. If poor judgment drives people to resist, then the struggle can only be decided by superior strength if legal and judicial machinery are not created to resolve these issues. An unjust enterprise can only be opposed by a group of employees united into a single person if there is any hope of victory. P.S. We're in a section where he's rambling about the utility of unions fairly sensibly, but he'll stop rambling eventually and go back to some other rant. The organizing of a union may lead to stronger social ties in daily life, and then to the removal of problems which continue to produce dissatisfaction and complaints. The existing state of dissatisfaction can be blamed on those who have managed to obstruct all attempts at legal regulation by using their political influence. He's doing the thing. Now, the Social Democrats dug their fingers so deeply into the labor movement that the political privileged class failed to understand or did not want to understand the importance of union organization and actively opposed it. In the process of their opposition, they lost sight of their real purpose and began fighting for different objectives. The Social Democrats had no intention of allowing the union movement to continue its original goal. No, that is not what they had in mind. Indeed, Marxists co-opt things. Within a few decades, their trained hand had turned a method of defending human and social rights into an instrument for destroying the national economy. Think of the teachers' unions, guys, and what they've done to the schools. The interest of the workers had no place in their plans. Even in politics, the use of economic pressure is a strong extortion tool as long as one side has little or no conscience, and the other side is sufficiently stupid and has sheep-like patience. Presently, both requirements are fulfilled, which is a pretty sick burn if you must categorize these things. Even by the turn of the century, he says, the labor union movement no longer served its original purpose. From year to year, it was drawn more and more to the sphere of social democratic, that's communist, politics, until it finally served only as a battering ram in the class struggle. The Social Democrats, also known as the Bolsheviks in Russia, assumed that the Social Democrats assumed that continual blows would make the whole economic structure tumble. Then the state, deprived of its economic foundations, would suffer the same fate. The representation of the working people's real interest played less and less a part in the social democratic agenda. Yeah, they use the workers. They don't actually represent the workers. Eventually, political concerns made relieving the social and cultural problems of the workers undesirable. If the workers were not distressed and were fully satisfied, and their will was no longer fueled by resentment, there would have been a danger that they could no longer be used as an army. So again, he's got these Marxists pretty well identified. Intuitively sensing this development, the leaders of the class struggle fell into such a panic that eventually they simply refused to bring about any beneficial social improvement and actually took a decided stand against any improvements for the workers. There was no need to be embarrassed by such seemingly incomprehensible behavior. They could avoid it by constantly increasing their demands on businesses, which made the rejection of any proposed improvement appear as if the business was engaged in a diabolical attempt to cripple the workers' most sacred rights. Considering the minimum thinking power of the masses, the social democratic success was not surprising. I had something I was going to say, and then I got all worked up in that part of the paragraph. What was I going to say? Like I said, he has this correctly identified, how the Marxists work. The Marxists do not want the improvement of the workers. They begin to, in fact, immiserate the workers because they need the workers to stay radicalized, right? And they make absolutely no intentions of improving any of the circumstances, and just want to make things worse so that they can keep this, as he says, this diabolical attempt to cripple the workers' most sacred rights. I lost track of whatever the important point was. It'll come back. The privileged class camp, he says, was outraged at these obviously deceptive social democratic tactics. It was something about how we're in this very similar situation is what I was going to say, about how, primarily in education, there's absolutely no attempt to improve education whatsoever. But we have a lot of problems within the professional world as well. And so what Hitler is analyzing here is the way that the Marxists exploit that situation to their own advantage. And he says, considering the minimum thinking power of the masses, the social democratic success is not surprising. But the privileged class camp, he says, was outraged at these obviously deceptive social democratic tactics, but they still base their actions on the statements made by the social democrats, which are lies, right? The social democrats' fear of raising the working class from its abyss of cultural and social misery should have led their opponents to make supreme efforts to improve the workers' lives. That's right. Delivering creates stability. Stability repels revolutions. They would have gradually twisted the weapons from the hands of the socialist leaders of the class struggle, but this did not happen. Instead of attacking and capturing the enemy position of the high moral ground themselves, they preferred to be squeezed and shoved. Finally, in their negotiation battles with the unions, they relented and gave in to the changes that, no matter how far-reaching, were insufficient for the socialists. We've seen this before. Whatever demands they make, there's more demands. The Social Democrats easily rejected the changes because it was too little, too late. Everything remained the same, except now there was more dissatisfaction than ever among both the workers and the business owners. Even then, the Free Trade Union already hung like a menacing storm cloud on the political horizon, and loomed over the existence of everyone. It was one of the worst terrorist instruments against the security and independence of the national economy, against the unity of the state, and against the freedom of individuals. This turned the idea of democracy into a ridiculous and disgusting cliche. Doesn't that sound familiar? It was an outrage against freedom and forever mocked the idea of a brotherhood as demonstrated in the saying, quote, "If you will not be a comrade too, it means a broken skull for you," end quote. So this, Hitler says, this is how I came to understand mankind. Through the years, my views broadened and deepened, but there was no need to change my way of thinking. The more I understood the outer nature of social democracy, communism, the more I longed to understand the inner core of the doctrine. The official party literature was not very useful here. It is incorrect in both details and in the proof it offers for economic questions. It is also untruthful in its discussion of political aims. Besides, I was especially repelled by the dishonest and unethical manner in which it was presented. Sentences are written using a lot of vague words with unintelligible meanings that are as clever as they are senseless. Only those unconventional types rotting among us could possibly feel at home in this intellectual maze. They scrape some, quote, spiritual experience from this artsy literary manure, and the message is assisted by the humility of our people who think something is deep and wise just because they don't understand it. You know, as an anti-woke crusader myself, I hate to say that I wish I wrote that paragraph about it, but that's correct. And I think every one of you that's out there working against the woke nonsense knows that that's exactly how it goes. But Hitler isn't doing so good with this. Well, he says, despite understanding it correctly, but he's proving that he understands it, right? He says, I gradually built a clear picture of its inner intent by balancing the theoretical untruth and the nonsense of this doctrine with its actual outward appearance. When I began to understand, fear and horror crept over me. I saw a teaching compounded by ego and hatred, which according to mathematical law could very well lead to victory, but would then lead to the end of humanity as well. During this time, I learned about the connection between this doctrine of destruction and the nature of a people. Up until now, this was unknown to me. Okay. So some of you are probably out there thinking what I thought the first time I read this as an anti-woke person reading it. Holy crap, that's really good. How in the world can that be in this book? How in the world can that be Hitler's analysis of Marxism and how Marxism works? What in the world took it from there to Nazism, which is what we end up getting? And again, this is my point. This podcast that I've wanted to do for years, probably 3 years at least, maybe longer. This podcast, the point of this podcast is we find ourselves in similar conditions and we have the historical fact of Nazism as a cautionary tale about what not to do. So let's start with Hitler's next paragraph. He says, a knowledge of the Jews is the necessary key. Let's start that again. A knowledge of the Jews is the necessary key to grasping the real intentions of social democracy, which is aka Bolshevik Marxism. A knowledge of the Jews is the missing piece. So up till there, you're like, wow, he really understood what was going on. I wonder what he's going to do with it. A knowledge of the Jews is the necessary key to grasping the real intentions of social democracy. If a person knows these people, the mask of delusion hiding their aims and the meaning of the party falls from his eyes, and the ape-like face of Marxism grins at him. As it speaks, a fog of social talk flows from the ugly smirk on his face. Now that was a turn you probably weren't expecting, except that you know what book it's in. I'm thinking that all of the people that we're seeing today saying it's the Jews, it's the Jews. If you understand the Jews, then you can name who it is. Name who it is, James. Name the Jews. These people are making the same mistake made by the author of this book, who went on to be the author of one of the world's greatest historical catastrophes. Today, he tells us, I still find it difficult, if not impossible, to remember when the word Jew first developed a special meaning for me. I do not remember ever hearing the word mentioned at home during my father's lifetime. I think the old gentleman would have considered it uncultured or antiquated to emphasize the designation at all. In the course of his life, he developed a mixed bag of views, which had survived in me along with my extreme nationalist sentiments and colored my feelings. So here we have a picture, by the way, into Hitler's youth. How did he grow up? Well, not anti-Semitic. In fact, his father would have found it beneath them to be anti-Semitic. However, extreme nationalism. At school, he's completely ignorant of Jews. In fact, it didn't mean anything to him. It wasn't special to him. It didn't have any significance, he said. And he doesn't remember when that started. But he says at school, there was nothing to change the ideas I received at home. I did meet a Jewish boy in secondary school whom we all treated with caution, but only because experience had taught us to mistrust him due to his quietness. None of us thought much about this. I didn't encounter the word Jew very often, not until I was 14 or 15, and then primarily in connection with political talks. I felt a slight aversion to it and could not help but have an unpleasant feeling when I became involved in religious arguments, but at that time I did not see any other significance. The city of Linz only had a few Jews. In the course of centuries, they had become outwardly Europeanized and looked human. There's a sentence, right? In fact, I even thought they were Germans. I did not realize the nonsense behind this notion, because I believed their only distinguishing mark was a strange religion. Persecution for their religion and hostile comments against them often brought my objection in return. I had no idea that organized hostility against the Jews even existed, so he certainly didn't grow up anti-Semitic. Then I came to Vienna. I was fascinated by the architecture and preoccupied with my own fate. At first, being a man, thinking of yourself in main character terms and as a creature of destiny and fate is probably not that healthy, by the way. At first, I was not concerned with the classes of people in the large city, although there were already nearly 200,000 Jews among the 2 million people of Vienna. I did not see them. My eyes and mind could not grasp all the values and ideas in the first few weeks. Only when I began to settle in did I begin to look more closely at my new world and see the busy scene more clearly. That's when I encountered the Jewish question. I cannot say that the way I encountered it was particularly agreeable. At first, I only saw the religious aspect of the Jew, and for reasons of human tolerance, I maintained my opposition to religious attacks. The tone of the anti-Semitic press in Vienna seemed unworthy of the cultural tradition of a great people. I was bothered by the memory of certain happenings in the Middle Ages, which I did not want to see repeated. And here there's an editor's note. All through the Middle Ages, Jews were blamed for any bad occurrence and killed by the thousands at a time. Some cities blamed them for the Black Death plague. Some areas exiled them or forced them into ghettos. Others required them to wear yellow cloth armbands or buttons, and they were restricted from certain fields of work all throughout the Middle Ages. So that's the end of the editor's note. Back to Hitler. Since the newspapers in question were not generally considered among the most outstanding quality, I thought they were the product of an angry envy rather than the result of principle, even if it was wrong. My belief was strengthened. So notice he recognizes that anti-Semitism is caused by envy, but he changed his mind. My belief, he says, was strengthened by what I considered the infinitely more dignified and commendable way in which the truly great newspapers answered those attacks. They did not even mention them, but responded with silence. Eagerly, I read the World Press, the New Free Press, a Vienna newspaper, the Vienna Daily newspaper, etc., and I was astonished at how much they offered the reader and at their objectivity. I also admired their dignified tone. Occasionally, I did not like their pretentious style, but I thought it might be more acceptable in the bustle of the cosmopolitan city. Since I considered Vienna such a city, I thought this amateur explanation might be a sufficient excuse, but the way these newspapers played up stories in the royal court's favor did repel me more than once. There was rarely an event at the Hofburg Imperial Palace which was not told to the reader in tones of enraptured ecstasy or grief-stricken sorrow. When an event dealt with the wisest monarch of all times, it almost read like a mating dance between lovers. The whole thing seems so fake. Fake news. I thought that such a policy was a stain on the ideal of liberal democracy. The way they would crawl for the court's approval and betray the dignity of the nation. This was the first bad feeling I developed about the press. As always, I followed every event in Germany with a burning concentration, whether political or cultural. With proud admiration, I compared the rise of the Reich with the sickness and decline of the Austrian state. Happenings outside Austria were mostly a source of pure pleasure. The less agreeable events at home often brought worry and gloom. I did not approve of the fight then being carried on against Wilhelm II. I saw him not only as the German emperor, but primarily as the creator of a German navy. I was extraordinarily annoyed when the German parliament forbade the emperor to speak in the parliament. The prohibition came from a people who had no reason to object, considering the fact that these parliamentary geese chattered more nonsense in a single session than a whole dynasty of emperors could produce in centuries. Another sick burn about the parliament there. I was outraged, he says. I was outraged at the heir of the imperial crown could receive, quote, reprimands from the shallowest chattering institution in a state where every half-wit claimed the right to criticize and might even be turned loose on the nation as a, quote, lawgiver. But I was even more angered when the Vienna press, which bowed to the lowest member of the royal court hoping for some attention, now expressed doubts about the German emperor. Their apparent concerns seem more like, notice he's rambling, he's off point again. He's forgot about the Jews, he's got a bitch about the Vienna press. Their apparent concerns seem more like malice, in my opinion. They quickly claimed that they had no intention of meddling in the affairs of the German emperor, heaven forbid, but they pretended that by touching a delicate spot in such a friendly way, they were fulfilling a duty resulting from the mutual alliance between the two countries, and at the same time discharging their obligations of journalistic truthfulness. The finger pushed into the sore spot and dug ruthlessly into the wound. Cases like this made the blood rush to my head. This is what gradually made me regard the great press with more caution. I did have to admit that one of the anti-Semitic papers, the German People's Paper, was honorable on occasion. Another thing that bothered my nerves was the revolting cult of France, which the big papers were then propagating. It was enough to make a person ashamed of being German. We were constantly bombarded with praises to the great civilized nation. More than once, this wretched spell of French captivation made me lay down one of the world papers. In fact, I began to turn to the German People's Paper more often, which was much smaller, but cleaner in such matters. I disliked the sharp anti-Semitic tone, but I did occasionally read arguments which gave me something to think about. Such stories eventually educated me about the man and the movement which then governed Vienna's destiny, Dr. Karl Lueger and the Christian Socialist Party. Editor's note says here, Karl Lueger was a member of the Christian Socialist Party, which was an anti-Semitic party. He was also the mayor of Vienna from 1897 to 1910, which made him mayor until Hitler was almost 21 years old. Hitler goes on, when I came to Vienna, I was hostile to both. In my eyes, the man and the movement were opposed to political and social change. However, a sense of common justice forced me to change my opinion gradually as I learned about the man and his work. Eventually, my opinion grew into admiration, so I started to admire the Christian socialist. Today, more than ever, I consider the man the greatest German mayor of all times. But how many of my preconceived views were upset by this change in attitude toward the Christian socialist movement? My opinions on anti-Semitism also slowly changed with the passing of time, and this was the most difficult change I ever went through. It was the most difficult of all my spiritual struggles. Only after battling for months between understanding and feelings did the voice of reason finally win. This is the kind of mistake your kids are getting exposed to, by the way, from relentless propaganda online. 2 years later, feelings followed understanding, and from then on, understanding was the most faithful watchman and guardian I could have had with me. During my bitter struggle between emotional ties to what I learned as a child and cold reason, the streets of Vienna offered me priceless first-hand lessons. The time had come when I no longer walked blindly through the vast city as I did at first. I kept my eyes open and looked at people as well as at buildings. Once, as I was strolling through the inner city, I suddenly met a figure in a long kaftan with black curls. "Is that a Jew?" was my first thought. Jews did not look like this in Linz. I covertly observed the man, once again being a weirdo. I covertly observed the man, but the longer I stared at that alien face, scrutinizing feature after feature, my question changed from, "Is that a Jew?" to, "Is that a German?" As always, I tried to resolve my doubts through books. For a few coins, I bought the first anti-Semitic pamphlets I had ever purchased in my life. Unfortunately, they were all based on the theory that the reader grasped or at least was familiar in principle with the Jewish question. Their tone made me feel new doubts because of the often shallow and unscientific proofs they offered. I would relapse to my former way of thinking for weeks, sometimes months. The matter seemed so monstrous and the accusations so unrestrained that I feared it might be unjust for me to decide one way rather than another. And again, I became timid and uncertain. I want you to pause, Mom, and imagine your 15, 16, 17, 22-year-old son encountering this propaganda, this Nazi propaganda, this anti-Semitic propaganda on social media, and to put him in these shoes. It's a cause for concern. If Hitler had extreme doubts about whether or not it was okay to become anti-Semitic, after finally encountering the anti-Semitic publications for the first time and seeing them as inadequate and unscientific and ghastly, but then slowly being convinced, and his question being, "Is this person Jew? This strange person I see a Jew? Wait, is he German? Like, does he qualify? Is he still German, looking and acting like this?" Just pause to consider what the effect of the anti-Semitic press had on a doubting Hitler and where that went. He was, unlike millions of Germans, not anti-Semitic to begin with. He had to be convinced of his anti-Semitism. And look where that went. Here's what he says. "Even I could no longer doubt that this was a question about a people in itself and not about Germans of a particular religious persuasion. Since I had begun to occupy myself with the question and pay attention to the Jew, Vienna had appeared to me in a new light. Wherever I went now, I saw Jews, and the more I saw, the more clearly my eye distinguished them from other people. The inner city and the districts north of the Danube Canal were especially filled with people who didn't look anything like Germans. If I continued to have doubts, my indecision was ended by the attitude of the Jews themselves. A great movement among many of them, especially in Vienna, sharply emphasized the special character of Jewry as a separate people, Zionism. So I want you to think again about the propaganda that your children, your young teenager and 20-something children in particular, are subjected to, but that our whole movement and our whole society are being subjected to in light of what you just heard. Only some of the Jews approved of this movement, Hitler tells us, And while the great majority condemned and even rejected the very idea, the appearance of the movement melted away in an evil fog of excuses. I could even say lies. So-called liberal Jewry rejected the Zionists as Jews who were impractical and perhaps dangerous in their public adherence to Judaism. It made no difference. They were all still Jews. There was no real separation, and they maintained their internal solidarity. This fictitious conflict between the Zionists and the liberal Jews soon disgusted me. It was false through and contradicted to the moral dignity and pure character their race had always prided itself upon. Morality and purity of character were terms that had their own meaning among these people anyway. It was obvious from their unclean appearance that they were not water lovers. I am sorry to say that this was very clear. Even with my eyes closed, I was frequently nauseated by the smell of these kaftan wearers. In addition, their clothes were dirty and they generally looked poor. All this was unattractive enough by itself, but one was positively repelled when they realized uncleanliness went beyond personal filth and into the moral mudstains of these people. My greatest concern was the activities of the Jews in certain fields of life. I slowly penetrated this mystery. Was there any shady understanding, any form of foulness, especially in cultural life, in which at least one Jew did not participate? Let's pause. Let's think about the propaganda that we see. We see these posters, whether it's about pornography, whether it's about banking or whatever it is, and you see these posters that people make with the Jews that work in there, right? So what did Hitler say? My greatest concern was the activity. Sorry, let's go back even beyond that. I was positively repelled when they realized uncleanliness went beyond personal filth and into the moral mudstains of these people. Was there any shady undertaking, any form of foulness, especially in cultural life, in which at least one Jew did not participate? The people making this mistake, again, are not making this mistake by accident. They're doing this on purpose, and they are leading our children and our young people and the broader movement into this mistake. If you carefully punctured this abscess with a knife, Hitler says, like a maggot in a rotten body who is blinded by the sudden influx of light, you would discover a kike, ein Judlein, if I said that right. I saw a great burden of guilt fall upon Jewry when I came to understand how it controlled the press, the influence in art, in literature, and in the theater. Again, I urge you to think of the propaganda that we are being fed today, the anti-Semitic propaganda. All their slimy declarations now meant little or nothing, Hitler says. It was enough to look at one of the billboard pillars and study the names credited for the awful movie or theatrical presentations in order to be firmly convinced of the Jewish problem. I urge you to think of the propaganda that we are swimming in. There is a reason I recorded a podcast entitled It Never Again Is Now. Here they were, infecting the people with a pestilence, an intellectual pestilence worse than the Black Death of ancient days. This poison was produced and distributed in massive quantities, too. Naturally, the more immoral these artists and producers are, the more they grow. Such a fellow flings his garbage in the face of humanity like a windmill. Do not forget their unlimited number. For every one German writer like Goethe, nature plants at least 10,000 of these slimy creatures in the pelt of humanity where they poison the people with their disease. It was a dreadful but inescapable fact that the Jew seemed specifically chosen by nature in tremendous numbers for this horrible destiny. Are we supposed to assume that this is the way that he is, quote, chosen? At that time, I began to carefully examine the names of all the producers of these unclean products in the world of art. and this scrutiny only damaged my attitude toward the Jews more. Though my feelings were outrage times 1,000, I must surrender to my reason and let it draw the conclusions. It was true that 9/10 of all the literary filth, artistic trash, and theatrical nonsense must be attributed to a people constituting scarcely 1/100th of the country's population. It was a plain fact. I am again asking you to consider the types of propaganda that you are seeing, the anti-Semitic propaganda that we are swimming in. My point with this podcast, my point in reading this chapter, my point in showing you that Hitler had a pretty dead-to-rights analysis of Marxism in practice and in theory. My point was, here we find ourselves in similar conditions and we are being invited to make the same mistakes. This story, the Nazi story, is one of the grandest cautionary tales of history. We are being invited to make the same mistakes, the same propaganda, the same lines of thought. I hear these things on the internet almost every day. I hear them from people in the conservative movement. My first encounter with somebody that I would consider woke right was in January of 2021, and one of the key points that they brought up at the time was that I needed to notice. It's noticing things, noticing about who's producing the films, noticing who's producing the artistic trash and the theatrical nonsense. I had to notice who were the Frankfurt School members that you talk about, James. James, you go up and you talk about the neo-Marxists. Who were they? Well, Marcuse, Horkheimer, Adorno. Well, what did they have in common? Walter Benjamin, what did they have in common? Well, they were all of Jewish background, and they were all communists. I've always focused on the latter, that it matters that they are communists, but it's possible to believe that it's relevant that they are all of Jewish background, and that that's the fact that matters. And it is possible to then extrapolate and say, well, Marx was of Jewish background, and Lenin was of Jewish background. And in fact, look how many bad people doing bad things are of Jewish background. It is possible to walk this same road that Hitler walked and make the same mistake and become convinced that he was right, and be convinced, as the propaganda tells us, that he may in fact have been the hero of history here, not Churchill, who stopped him. He says, I now began to scrutinize even my beloved newspapers from the world press. The deeper I probed, the more my previous admiration shrank. The style grew more intolerable. I objected to the content as flat and shallow. Why? Because he was woke. He has a second dimension to his thinking now. The objectivity was transformed into more of a lie than honest truth. Of course, the authors were Jews. 1,000 things which I had once barely noticed now struck me as remarkably obvious, because he's woke. While others, which had merely given me something to think about, I began to grasp and understand. I could now see the liberal sentiments of this press in a new light. The dignified tone in replying to attacks, as well as the silent responses, now revealed a trick as shrewd as it was low. Their enraptured theatrical criticisms always favored a Jewish author, while their disapproval never fell on anyone except a German. The constant and quiet sneering at William II revealed that they had a deliberate plan. Their advocacy of French culture and civilization also played into their schemes. The trashy content of the short stories now became an indecency, and I heard sounds of an alien people in the language. The general sense was so clearly harmful to everything German that it could only be intentional. But who had an interest in this? Was it all mere chance? Gradually, I became unsure. Gradually, you became woke, Hitler. You became a woke nationalist. My development was accelerated, he says, by the insights I gained into a series of other matters. This was the general display of manners and morals openly shown by most of Jewry. The street sign offered some truly ugly object. Sorry, I messed that all up. The street again offered some truly ugly object lessons. The relationship of Jewry to prostitution, and even more to white slavery itself, could be studied in Vienna more so than in probably any other Western European city, with the possible exception of southern French seaport towns. If a person walked the streets and alleys of Leopoldstadt in the evening, all along the way you could see things which remained hidden from the great majority of the German people. Well, its editor's note says the area was a heavily Jewish and considered a ghetto. These things remained secret until the First World War gave the soldiers on the Eastern Front an opportunity, or rather forced them to see similar happenings. It sent a chill down my spine when I first realized the Jew was the manager of this immoral trade among the scum of the city. He was icy calm and shamelessly businesslike, which made me fuming angry. Now I no longer evaded discussing the Jewish question. Now I wanted to discuss it. I had seen the Jew in every area of cultural and artistic life, and then suddenly encountered him in another spot where I would have least expected to see him, and I recognized the Jew as the leader of social democracy, the Marxists. And that is when the blinders fell from my eyes. Suddenly, a long spiritual struggle came to an end. I can't tell you how many people calling themselves influencers could have written that paragraph. And I mean influencers your kids watch, that our movement listens to. I see them frequently. I was astonished how easily my fellow workmen changed their minds over a question. Often their opinion changed within a few days, sometimes even within a few hours. They turned around. I could hardly understand how people who individually held reasonable views could suddenly lose them the moment they came under the spell of the masses. It was enough to drive a person crazy. I would argue for hours and finally believe I had broken the ice or cleared up some piece of nonsense they had in their heads. I would feel pride in my success, and then the next day I would be stressed to find out I had to begin all over again. It had all been for nothing. Their crazy opinions seemed to always swing like a pendulum. I think he's talking about arguing with Marxists, by the way. I could understand how they felt. They were dissatisfied with their place in life. They cursed fate, which often dealt them such hard knocks. They hated the businessmen who seemed to be the heartless tools of fate, and criticized government offices which in their eyes had no sympathy for the workers' situation. They demonstrated against food prices and marched through the streets in support of their demands. All of this I could understand, but what I could not understand was the boundless hatred they felt for their own nation, the way they despised its grandeur, the way they defiled its history, the way they dragged great men in the gutter. In other words, that they weren't woke nationalists. This struggle against their own kind, against their own nest, their own homeland, was as senseless as it was incomprehensible. It was unnatural. They could temporarily be cured of this vice, but only for days or for weeks at the most. Later, if one met a supposed convert, he may have fallen back into his old self against his fellow men. His unnatural tendencies would again have him in their grip. I gradually came to realize that the social democratic press consisted mostly of Jews. But I attached no particular importance to this situation. Circumstances were the same at the other newspapers. One thing was remarkable to me. There was not one paper where Jews worked that I would have considered a proud national voice that was in line with my concept of national pride. Again, there are lots of influencers today who I think could say the same thing, but instead of newspapers, they would say channels. I forced myself to at least make an attempt at reading this Marxist journalism, but the more I did, the more I disliked it. I now tried to get closer to the manufacturers of these mischievous words. From the editors on down, they were all Jews. I picked up every social democratic pamphlet I could and looked up the author's name. Jews. I noticed the names of almost all the leaders. Most of them were also members of the chosen people, the Jews, whether they were representatives in the government or secretaries of the unions, chairmen of organizations, or street agitators. The same uncanny picture was continually repeated. I will never forget the names of Austerlitz, David, Adler, Ellenbogen, and others. One thing was plain to me now: the leadership of the party, whose petty representatives I had to fight my most violent battles with for months, consisted almost exclusively of an alien people. I then had the happy satisfaction of knowing for certain that the Jew was no German. Now, for the first time, I became thoroughly familiar with the corrupter of our people. This is the mistake. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the problem. And what is this problem? It's woke nationalism. There is a concept of the German people that has now been suppressed by the alien. That's the fundamental Gnostic construction. The demiurgic alien has corrupted or held down the people who don't understand who they really are. So we just talked about the Germans who don't understand their national pride. An alien force is imprisoning us in our own circumstance that we could liberate from if we knew who we really were, if we knew who we were as a national people, as a folk, and that folk could become the basis of a Reich. That's the idea. That's woke nationalism. And that's what he's woken up to. That's how he's decided to interpret his circumstances. That's how he's decided to interpret that analysis. That is the error that we must avoid, because the Nazi experiment was a cautionary tale. That there are wrong ways that we might deal with the problems of our time. Living 1 year in Vienna, he said, had been enough to convince me that no worker is too inflexible to yield to greater knowledge and superior enlightenment. I had gradually become an authority on their own doctrine, which I used as a weapon in the battle for my convictions. Success was almost always on my side. The great mass of people could be saved. He picked up the Marxist method and used it to start converting German workers back the other way. That's what he's talking about here. He said the great mass of people could be saved, even if it was only by the greatest sacrifice of time and patience, but no Jew could ever be freed from his opinion. In those days, I was still childish enough that I would try to explain the madness of their doctrines to them. In my own little circle, I talked until my tongue was sore and my throat was hoarse, and I thought I must succeed in convincing them how destructive their Marxist madness was. But the very opposite was the result. Growing insight into the destructive effect of social democratic theories only increased these people's determinations. The more disputes I had with them, the better acquainted I became with their arguing techniques. First, they would count on the stupidity of their adversaries, and then, if there was no way out, they pretended to be stupid themselves. If all else failed, they claimed they did not understand, or being challenged, they would instantly jump to another subject and talk about obvious truths. If these were, by the way, he's talking about what it's like to talk to a woke person. I'm not joking. He means that. He's saying this. He's arguing with the Marxists. If these were agreed on, they immediately applied them to entirely different matters. When they were caught off guard, they would avoid the conversation and claim they had no knowledge or understanding of the issue. No matter where you seized one of these apostles, your hand grasped slimy ooze, which spurted through your fingers, only to unite again in the next moment. If your argument really gave a man a shattering defeat in front of others, he could do nothing but agree. You might suppose that this was one step forward, and how surprised you would be the following day. The next morning you would find the Jew. It was the Marxist, now it's the Jew. The Jew has not even the slightest memory of yesterday and continues to repeat the old mischievous nonsense as if nothing had happened at all. When pressed about the previous conversation, he would pretend astonishment and could remember nothing at all except the truth of his statements, which he felt had been proven the day before. Frequently, I was simply paralyzed. It was hard to know what to admire the most, their fluency or their artistry in lying. Gradually, I began to hate them. There was one good result in all of this, my love for my own people, his Volk, the Deutsch Volk, or Volksdeutsch, Deutsch, it's German, I don't know. My love for my own people was bound to grow just as fast as the expansion of social democracy. After all, considering the diabolical skillfulness of these seducers, who could possibly condemn their poor victims? It was unbelievably difficult for me to master and overcome the contradictory lies of this race. Went from Marxists to the race. Any success with people who twisted the truth was immediately turned around. They would make a statement one moment to counter your argument, and the next moment use the same reasons they just tried to discredit in order to prove their own point. No. The better I became acquainted with the Jew, the more I could forgive the worker. That's much more messed up than you think. Especially because by Jew he means Marxist. At this point, the mistake he's made is he's equated Jew and Marxist. Marxist equals Jew, Jew equals Marxist. In my opinion, those to blame were not the workers. The blame fell squarely on those who did not think it worthwhile to sympathize with their own kinsfolk. So this is a woke, folkish, woke nationalist movement. With those who would not give to the hard-working son of the national family what was by the iron logic of justice. What was his by the iron law of justice. The blame fell on the same seducer and corrupter who should be placed against the wall. This is not mild rhetoric that he's using. He's pissed off at these people, right? But he's now conceiving of this in terms of there's this nation, and the people within the nation are its children, and the children should benefit from the nation. But here are these corruptors and seducers who don't want that to happen, and they're usurpers, and they're going to steal from, and they need to be put up against the wall. Stimulated by the experience of daily life, he says, I now began to search for the sources of the Marxist doctrine itself. Now that I had come to understand its effect in detail, every day its success caught someone's attention, and with a little imagination I could see where the results were leading us. The only question remaining was whether the founders had foreseen the results of their creation in its final form, or whether they were victims of error. I felt that both answers were possible. Anybody who's dealt with woke understands that. On the one hand, it was the duty of every thinking person to force his way into the front ranks of the cursed movement and try to prevent it from going to extremes. On the other hand, the actual creators of this national disease must have been true devils. Only in the brain of a monster, not a human being, could an organization's plan take shape that would eventually result in the collapse of human civilization and the desolation of the world. If this were the case, the last hope was battle, a battle by every weapon which the human mind, understanding, and will could grasp, no matter who fate blessed. I began to familiarize myself with the founders of this doctrine in order to study the foundations of the movement. I was able to obtain results sooner than I had even dared to hope because of my new, not yet profound knowledge of the Jewish question. That alone allowed me to compare its realities with the theoretical shuffling by the founding apostles of this social democracy movement. It had taught me to understand the language of the Jewish people, who speak to conceal or at least veil their thoughts. Their real purpose is often not in the writing itself, but sleeping snugly between the lines. This was a time when my spirit experienced the greatest upheaval it has ever endured. I turned away from a weak set of political notions and into a fanatical anti-Semite. Once more, and for the last time, restless, uneasy, and depressive thoughts came to me in my extreme anxiety. So Hitler's describing himself going crazy, becoming a rabid, fanatical anti-Semite. And again, I point out, we are in similar situations. We are inundated with propaganda that invites people to make the mistake that he's made. The mistakes, we talked about some before, but the mistake I'm talking about, the key mistake, is that he has equated Marxism and Jewish. And that Jewish needs to be thought of as a race. And that race needs to be thought of as fundamentally distinct from German. And now in his own words, he is a fanatical anti-Semite. But once more, and for the last time, he says, restless, uneasy, and oppressive thoughts came to me in my extreme anxiety. So he's been studying the the founding apostles. I assume that that's going to include Marx and Engels and Lenin, maybe Stalin, who also wrote Marxism and the National Question there in Vienna just a few years before. He's troubled for a last time, though, and he says, I had researched the work of the Jewish people during long periods of human history, and suddenly I was struck by the alarming question of whether the mysteries of fate had irrevocably determined that the final victory was not the destiny of our little people for reasons unknown to we puny humans. The Jews are a people which live for this earth alone. Could they have been promised the earth as their reward? Do we have an objective right to fight for self-preservation? Or is this just an illusion? I buried myself in the teachings of Marxism and gave calm, clear consideration to the work of the Jewish people. Fate itself gave me my answer. And then he closes the chapter this way. The Jewish doctrine of Marxism. So there's the error that he's committed to. The Jewish doctrine of Marxism denies the noble goal of nature and sets mass and dead weight of numbers in place of the eternal privilege of strength and power. It denies the value of personality in man, disputes the significance of nation and race, and deprives mankind of the essentials of its survival and civilization. As the foundation of the universe, Marxism would be the end of any order conceivable to man. The result of applying such a law could only be chaos. Destruction would be the only result for the inhabitants of this planet. If, through his Marxist faith, the Jew conquers the peoples of this world, his crown will be the death and destruction of all mankind. Earth would again move uninhabited through space as it did millions of years ago. Eternal nature takes its revenge for violation of her commandments. I believe I am acting today in the spirit of the Almighty Creator. By standing guard against the Jew, I am defending the work of the Lord. So that's the second chapter of Mein Kampf. That's the chapter chronicling how Adolf Hitler became in his own words, fanatical anti-Semite. He got there by studying and fighting with and observing Marxists who were driving him batshit crazy, as one is driven by dealing with Marxists, and by concluding that, in fact, what makes Marxists Marxist is not Marxism, but being Jewish. The sons of America are being seduced into these same views through relentless propaganda, posing sometimes as sophisticated arguments, sometimes presented as you've been lied to all along. Why don't you just listen to his speeches? He's nothing like you heard. Sometimes with kind of grand, maybe he was right. Look what happened to our humiliated and fallen people through the post-war consensus that we agreed to after FDR, who is a socialist, and Churchill teamed up with Stalin to stop Hitler and gave the communists the world, if not least through the United Nations and subsequently through the production or creation of the nation of Israel. This is the propaganda of our day. This is the invitation of our day. This is the humiliation of our day. These are the conditions. We find ourselves in parallel conditions to what Adolf Hitler was experiencing in Vienna in the early 1920s, and then before also, but what he was writing about in the early 1920s. We find ourselves in similar conditions, and those conditions are written through with similar propaganda, the anti-Semitic press that Hitler was talking about, that radicalized him extremely successfully, that got him to see the invisible hand of the Jew on everything, as he says, which became visible as he became woke, which awakened him to the necessity of a nationalist spirit that eventually became the basis for his program. I'm going to say what I've said all along. I'm going to say it again, and I'm going to shut up. The Nazi experiment was a cautionary tale. Under certain historical conditions, a nation or a people or a civilization, like Western civilization writ large, can find itself at the edge of a precipice. And it has to make a choice. It has to do something. It cannot merely go over the precipice. Maybe the sword's to its back. It has to do something. In the 1920s and going into the early 1930s, the German people found themselves in that situation. And there was the Nazi Party, organized by Adolf Hitler, who had developed this philosophy and articulated it in Mein Kampf some decade earlier. And they made a choice to try to deal with the circumstances of their civilization according to a program outlined in the book that I've just read the second chapter of to you. And what happened was an unmitigated catastrophe in every meaningful sense. The most brutal war that human beings have ever fought. The largest number dead ever from a war. A war that ended with nuclear fire being dropped on Germany's ally, Japan, with its imperial ambitions. A war that forever changed the world in terms of what we think about empire, colonialism, what we think about the use of chemical, biological, and nuclear and other weapons, and a Holocaust. The absolutely unnecessary and senseless murder, not just disenfranchisement, not just expropriation, but absolutely brutal, unbelievably brutal and senseless murder of 6 million Jews simply because Hitler had been transformed into a fanatical, in his own words, anti-Semite by the propaganda of anti-Semitic publications in the midst of those conditions he found so intolerable, including the condition of the relentless press of Marxism into his country. The Nazi experiment was a cautionary tale. Hitler did not have the right solution to the problems he was in. We may not know what the right solution to those problems are, although I think we do. And in fact, I think Hitler even pointed at some of them. You have to actually successfully deal with these problems. You have to successfully improve the circumstances for the masses of the people, the working class. We need to have the Trump administration racking up wins. We need to see some of these oppressive and ridiculous and inhuman policies turned back around. We need to start making progress. We also need to assert the individual liberties of every person, every single person who is a citizen of our country, and every single person in the sense of the dignity of man. If we truly believe what's written in our founding document that the Germans didn't have, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that we have no capacity whatsoever, as we the people here in America at least, to look at the Jew and say, but is that an American? History has given us a lesson on a wrong answer to intolerable circumstances. Never again is now, as I said in a previous episode, and I will say repeatedly as long as I have to. We must not repeat the errors of 1920s, 30s, and 40s Germany. Our moment to deal with this is now. We have the opportunities to create the solutions that diffuse the radical moment and to minister to our sons primarily, to our young people, our men and women, particularly under 30, and tell them that they are being lured into propaganda that exploits their vulnerability, their frustration, their anger, and leads them into the dehumanizing paths that characterize the worst parts of the 20th century, and that they can see that for themselves, and they can understand the cautionary tale that was the 20th century and World War II, and they can say no. And they can see the people peddling this propaganda, and they can say no more of you influencing me in my life. It's as easy on social media as an unfollow, a mute, and or a block. You don't have to listen to these people. It does not make you broad-minded. Never again is now. The Nazi experiment was a cautionary tale. We don't have to make the same mistakes.